Hey guys, this is Star What If. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see fourth part what if Harry Potter was reborn in second year and became Gilderoy Lockhart. Here is short summary. After dying, Harry is reborn in his second year, but in the body of Gilderoy Lockhart. Armed with his memories, magic, and a flair for deception, he sets out to change the wizarding world in his own cunning way. But before we start, if you want more stuffs like this, then please support to subscribe this channel and share with your friends. Let's start the video. Crabbe and Goyle were easy targets. They each had a house elf, so it was a repeat of Dollahof's manner. Wait until everyone except Crabbe, or Goyle, the seniors, of course, were gone and the house elf went shopping. Their vaults were depressingly low in galleons, so he took everything else. Replacing their manors with new was out of the question without borrowing serious amounts of galleons. Ragnarok arranged for him to loan the widows the galleons they needed, leaving them clearly in debt to House Black and having to follow House Black's lead in the Wizengamot. Should Voldemort return, Harry could always call in the debt and make Voldy spend his precious funds keeping them off the streets. Or increase dissension in the ranks by forcing them to beg their way into another Death Eater's home. In the meantime, he drastically reduced the ranks of rich Death Eaters, not to mention eliminating many of them with extreme prejudice, as the spy novels like to say. The Death Eater children in Hogwarts began to understand what it felt like to be on the losing side of a guerrilla-style war, and realizing they faced a future of belonging to the working class instead of ordering the working class around. Headmistress McGonagall's zero tolerance of bullying also made them far more circumspect in their attitudes towards those they felt were their inferiors. The fact that Sirius made no secret that he would blackball from employment anyone who didn't toe the line of tolerance certainly helped to make Hogwarts a fun experience for anyone who wasn't a pure-blood bigot. The book release in November left Harry, Gilderoy far too busy dealing with book signings and appearances to pay attention to the Death Eaters for several months. Things slowed down in late January and began to taper off in February. That was when he began to work earnestly on where in Albania he might find Voldy and how he could find him. The solution for Snape's home was simple. Time-consuming, but simple. He apparated nearby, then spent the day wandering around outside of the house's protective enchantments, locating the likely places an enchantment anchor stone might be hidden. As he found each one, he placed 2 stones carved with runes that acted as magical power leeches. When he was done, the power leeches would drain magic from the enchantment anchors faster than they could charge. In a week or so, he could just walk up to the house without tripping the protective enchantments. He only had to look out for traps. And he planned to take care of those the same way, dropping power leeches at potential trouble spots and coming back later. He wished he'd found that Cursebreaker kit in his first life. Using power leeches on the other Death Eaters' homes wouldn't work in any place with regular residents. The enchantment control stone would warn the inhabitants that something was wrong long before the power leeches were close to compromising the protective enchantments. In this case, though, not only wasn't the owner not in residence, he was in another country, Scotland. He wouldn't be checking back here until Christmas at the earliest. With luck, he wouldn't discover his home was gone until next summer. And while Snape had settled down at Hogwarts, he was still a Death Eater. Minnie had told him if he didn't shape up, she'd fire him. The current spate of attacks on Death Eaters had him feeling that staying at Hogwarts was a much safer ploy than being out in the wizarding world taking his chances that the vigilante might catch him unawares. So, he minded his P's and Q's and actually taught potions in a fair-minded manner. Whoever would have thought that would happen, Snape being fair. While he waited for the power leeches to do their job, he tackled Yaxley. Yaxley lived in a large manor in the country and had a single house elf. The man had a low-level job at the ministry and kept mostly to himself. As a result, the manor was empty except for the house elf every day from morning until evening. It was simply a matter of waiting for the house elf to go shopping. Harry opened a new vault. He would need to move quickly when he got Yaxley's vault key. In the meantime, Gilderoy had worked on the book signings for Burrowing with a Basilisk and editing Restraining a Rat. Their opportunity appeared in mid-December. Dobby ped into his study. "Wixie is shopping," he said. "Excellent, Dobby, You know what to do, I'll meet you there to get the key. Harry put away his quill and carefully marked his place. He changed to his stealth robes, a more smart, fashionable, and perfectly tailored copy of the Muggle military camouflage combat uniform, and apparated to his pre-scouted lookout point in time to see a fireball rising into the sky. Dobby joined him almost immediately. He waited only long enough for the flaming debris to stop falling before apparating closer and axioing the vault key. Unfortunately, nothing happened. He tried a second time, and still nothing. Damn. The wizard had figured out what he was doing and kept his vault key with him at all times. He sighed. Okay, Dobby, go back to whatever you were doing. Well, there was still a chance he might get Yaxley. Wixie, the wizard's house elf, would immediately feel the protective enchantment's catastrophic disappearance and try to contact her master to tell him the manor was under attack. Yaxley was at the ministry, so she would have to pop to the atrium and then run through the building to find him. The ministry spells would prevent her from using her elf magic to magically pop to her master. That would take about 10 minutes, passing security and running down the stairs to his office, if she knew where it was. If she didn't know, it would take a bit longer as she tried to get to him. Knowing where someone is spatially doesn't tell you how to get to them in the maze that was the ministry. Her explaining and him racing back to the atrium would take another 10 minutes, maybe longer if he took the elevator. He'd waste a few minutes trying the flow, then he would apparate. If Harry were really lucky, the bastard would apparate into what he thought was a safe spot in his manor. Instead, he would be in the middle of the inferno now raging where the manor had stood. The heat would kill him before he even knew he was on fire. If the ass was smart, he would apparate in at a distance and observe what was happening. What idiot would return to a home he knew an enemy occupied it and was potentially waiting in ambush? Harry never detected an incoming apparition or Yaxley's presence. Later, discreet inquiries revealed that no one had seen Yaxley since that day he had rushed out of the ministry. Harry knew he wasn't dead. The goblins refused to release his estate. Harry figured the wizard had gone to ground and was hiding in some Death Eater safe house Harry had never found in the future. Harry had already cleared out and beepy-trapped the ones he knew of, with alert enchantments to warn him if anyone appeared at one. A week after the Yaxley job, the power traps at Snape's home had drained the enchantment stones to the point of uselessness. Harry looked around the Snape's sitting room. It was pretty pathetic. The furniture was old and worn, not even a second-hand shop would take it. It would, however, make good fuel for a nice bonfire. Harry carefully examined every room using the detection spells in the Curse Breaker's kit looking for hidden items. The only thing of note was a staircase behind a bookshelf that led to Snape's potion workshop. That held many rare and expensive ingredients. This was where Snape spent his income, stockpiling ingredients against future needs. Or, perhaps, where most of Hogwarts' potion budget went. Harry wouldn't put it past Snape to siphon off as much of the budget for his personal projects as he could get away with stealing. Harry stripped the workshop down to the walls. The only other place Harry found of note was a safe hidden in the master bedroom filled with galleons. Harry didn't take the time to count, but from the size of the stack, compared to others he had seen, there should be around 50,000 galleons, maybe more. Probably taken from his Death Eater victims in the First War because his salary wasn't enough to create such a stockpile in 20 years, never mind 12, even if he didn't spend any of it. It didn't matter because he took it all anyway. There was no vault key. He didn't expect there to be. No one had ever accused Snape of being stupid. If Snape had one, he probably kept it with him at Hogwarts. Being a Muggle residence, the house was wired for electricity, even if Snape never used it. With a flick of his wand, Harry bypassed the gauge and made it look as if Snape were pirating electricity. Harry returned to the fuse box in the basement below the kitchen. He had several shrunken pieces of furniture and boxes of miscellaneous paper from upstairs with him. He restored the furniture and placed it against the wall beside the fuse box, with the boxes of paper directly below it and leaning against the furniture. He rearranged the rest of the loose contents of the Muggle basement to facilitate his plan. Then he cast incendio into the fuse box. The old-fashioned cloth-wrapped wires caught fire immediately, and Harry made sure some of the burning pieces of cloth fell onto the papers below. In moments, with the help of another incendio, everything in the basement was nicely burning. He retreated up the stairs and into the backyard, where he waited until he could see flames coming up the stairs. Then he apparated home. He knew some muggle would report the fire and the firemen would protect the nearby houses as Snape's place burnt. The dusty and dry condition of the house and its contents guaranteed that by the time the firemen arrived the place would be fully involved, and then burnt to the ground. The investigators, naturally, would conclude it started in the fuse box due to the old wiring and Snape's slipshod method of stealing the electricity. Arson would never be suspected. Except by Snape, that is. Harry knew he would immediately note the missing ingredients that should have fueled a much more intense and explosive fire as soon as he returned to the place. Not to mention the lack of anyone finding what amounted to over 1.5 tons of gold coins. Albus' funeral was during the Ides of March. The wizarding world, and the British especially, wasted a good amount of time, in Harry's opinion, mourning their hero, and remembering his great accomplishments. Thus, it was that today, April 28th, he was drifting at tree height on his broom in a remote valley in the accursed mountains of Albania, eyes half closed, trying to detect that indefinite loathsome trace of hate that was Voldemort. Disillusioned and covered with a notice me not charm so that neither muggles nor wizards might detect him, he moved back and forth across the valley. He had covered almost 3/4 of the valley and it was beginning to get dark. He wouldn't finish this tonight, he would have to come back tomorrow. He sighed. When he finished this leg of the sweep, he would land and apparate back to the village. Trusting his instincts had saved his life more times than he could count in the final war. So, when the urge to speed up abruptly hit him, he did so. The powerful cutting curse sliced off the back 2/3 of his broom's bristles instead of slamming into his side from underneath. The broom's integrity destroyed, it began to plummet, wildly jerking left, right, up, and down according to Harry's slightest movement. While this made it difficult for Harry to control his fall, it made it impossible for his assailant to hit him again. Spotting a small clearing created by a fallen tree, Harry apparated there, leaving the broom to drop down. He landed roughly, tumbling. He sprang to his feet and recast his disillusionment spell. How his attacker had spotted him he didn't know, and he wasn't going to take unnecessary chances. He hadn't the faintest idea where his attacker was, but that it was a Voldemort follower was certain. He held himself still, listening. He had to stay. If he left, they would leave knowing he was in pursuit and he wouldn't find them. "Point me Voldemort," Harry whispered. His wand spun, and then indicated to Harry's left. He turned and carefully made his way. He silenced his footsteps and his clothes and crept carefully through the bushes and debris littering the edges of the clearing. They saw through each other's disillusionment spell almost simultaneously. It was Yaxley. He must have survived and fled, figuring that finding his lost master was his only chance at surviving whomever was destroying the former Death Eaters. Both launched vicious attacks. Harry sent Reductos and Langlocks in almost a continuous stream, dodging the incoming spells from Yaxley rather than using a shield. Yaxley preferred Defindo, Defodio, Crucio, Expulso, and other dark curses. Neither could make any headway, it seemed. Suddenly, something slammed into Harry from the side. It felt like the entire inside of his head caught fire. It wasn't Crucio, though. His head seemed to be splitting in half, everywhere he looked he saw too. Yaxley pressed his advantage, casting faster. Harry threw up a Protega as he tried to recover, dodging desperately to avoid whatever the other Death Eater might send at him. It didn't work. He tripped over a branch he thought was farther to his left, and as he fell he saw another spell coming from the side. He screamed the activation phrase for his emergency portkey just as the spell hit him. Gary woke to a bouncing bed and a squealing little girl. "Get up! Get up! Get up!" she chanted, each one accompanied by a bounce. "Today we visit Harry. Get up! Get up!" Gary's head felt as if it were splitting and the bouncing was making him nauseous. "Stop!" The bouncing and chanting stopped. "Uncle Gil," came the childish voice. He slowly cracked one eyelid open and blearily looked at the excited black-haired girl. It was Belle, two of her, actually. The wide grin splitting her face was slowly subsiding, turning to a concerned frown. "Uncle Gil," she repeated. He groaned and raised his hand to his forehead, but hit himself in the face instead. Belle giggled. "Gee, get ss serious," he said awkwardly. She cocked her head sideways. "But, Uncle Gil, I'm not serious, he's upstairs." Gary groaned. It hurt too much for this to be funny. "CCK," he said, "head hurts." "Serious." Her eyes grew wide and she vanished off the bed at a dead run. He could hear her yelling before she even left the bedroom, "Serious. Uncle Gil's really sick." Well, at least he knew she had good lungs. She had been quite quiet last summer. The change was a great improvement. Exposure to the twins and gang had been good to her. Not to mention Nimmy, Remus, and Sirius during the school year. Later, after Sirius helped him drink headache and nausea potions, he felt well enough to sit up. "Thanks, Sirius," he said. He was still seeing double, but not as badly as before. The doubles were almost on top of each other, only offset by an inch or so. His muscle coordination was crap, though. "Maybe we should take you to St. Mungo's," Sirius suggested. "This sounds like the way you were last May. You were in for a full month, what between the cursed duel you fought and all. Maybe you're having a relapse." Last May. Harry knew he wasn't going to like the answer to his next question. He closed his eyes and sighed. "What month is it?" "November," piped up Belle from behind Sirius and Remus. Another heartfelt sigh. "Sirius, the last thing I remember is a duel in Albania and emergency port keying here." By now Sirius, Remus, Ted, Andromeda, and a wide-eyed Belle surrounded his bed. "Well," said Sirius slowly, as the other adults exchanged worried looks. "That's a deep subject, Sirius, think you can handle it?" Harry said dryly. They gave him a dumbfounded look. Belle giggled. His brain was starting to catch up. He frowned. Belle said something about seeing Harry. Sirius scowled heavily, as did most everyone except Belle. She started bouncing happily. "Yeah, today's the first task." "Bloody hell," whispered Gary. "Tri-Wizard Tournament." They nodded. "And Harry is in it?" "Yes," said Sirius. "Of course he was. Does he know he faces a dragon?" Sirius frowned. "Yes, you told him that the day after we found out. You had a nightmare the night he called us about his name being pulled from the goblet of fire." He looked at Remus. "You woke us up with your screaming. You told us that you had a vision that Harry would face a Hungarian horntail dragon. That he would outfly it using his firebolt but receive an injury on his shoulder from the dragon's tail hitting him." Sirius grinned. "He's been practicing Accio and a body shield charm every day since then. And flying, I'd wager. And I smuggled him a fire protection potion, just in case." He shook his head ruefully. "He had me send him 3 more, he said it wasn't fair that only he had that protection." He smiled to himself. "That's Lily, for sure." Gary relaxed a bit, thanking Merlin for small favors. At least it wasn't a total cock-up. And now that Sirius had told him, he vaguely remembered the incident. Of course, this year was the Tri-Wizard. The Ministry had been working on that for years. Losing Crouch and Dumbledore wouldn't have derailed those plans. He had hoped that Harry might be spared the whole Tri-Wizard thing, but apparently not. Thank Merlin nothing he had done had changed the planned champion trials, at least he hoped not. "Okay, I seem to have amnesia from last May until right now." And his coordination was way off. He hoped he wouldn't meet any Death Eaters. Death Eaters. Oh, Merlin, Moody. While the others were exchanging alarmed looks and Belle looked puzzled, Gary grabbed Sirius' arm. "Mad Eye. Is Mad Eye the DADA professor?" "Yes," Sirius said slowly. "Is that a problem?" "How well do you know Mad Eye?" Sirius traded looks with Remus. "Not that well. I trained with him in the Aurors, but that was 14 years ago. Of the family, Nimmy knows him best." "Do you know what he puts in his hip flask to drink?" Gary asked urgently. Sirius shrugged. "Water." Gary closed his eyes again, thinking. "Sirius, get Nimmy. Ask her if she knows what he keeps in his flask." Remus asked. "Why, Gil? He's an Auror. He's paranoid, yes, but he is the best Auror out there." Gary took a deep breath. "Nobody says a word, okay." He looked around as they hesitantly nodded. The others had forgotten Belle, but he could see her nodding in the background as well. He winked at her. She was still under the oath that no one else knew about, so he was unconcerned at her presence. I think Mad Eye is a polyjuiced Death Eater. They all objected. He waited for them to quiet down. Listen to me on this. I was right about the dragons, wasn't I? He paused a moment, then continued. Sirius, get Nimmy. Ask her what he drinks. If she doesn't know, we'll have to go with water. He looked at Belle. Or perhaps not. Using one of her hairs in polyjuice and swapping that might be much more entertaining, and quickly prove Gary's point. No, he decided upon reflection, the polyjuice would taste different. The Death Eater would immediately know something was wrong and try to escape. Although fighting while the potion changed him would be next to impossible. But still, it would leave him in full control of himself once he recovered. And as a little girl, no one would take his dueling talents seriously. He might slip away into the crowd. Go, Sirius, he ordered. This is important. Reluctantly, the older wizard left the room. Gary looked at the others. Give me a minute to get dressed and I'll meet you all in the kitchen for breakfast. He made a move to get out of bed. Dining room, said Remus. Breakfast is in the dining room. Gary nodded and waved them all to leave. Getting out of bed was a chore. It was his first day as Harry Gilderoy all over again. Fortunately, today's clothes were already laid out for him. When he saw the curlers in his hair, he sighed heavily. He had forgotten about putting them in last night, but he did want to look his best today. It would be the first time in several months that he was in public in a large crowd and he had his image to maintain. Usually let Gilderoy run the morning prep while he planned the day. This morning he did everything without really thinking about it while he still worked out what he would have to do today. It took him far longer than it should, but eventually he made his stumbling way to the dining room. There was a sideboard set up cafeteria style, the others had already started eating. The second time he dropped his plate Andy came over and helped. It was humiliating, but no worse than it had been in St. Mungo's. Smiling broadly and muttering thanks, he sat just as Sirius came bursting in from the sitting room. She says it's water, he said breathlessly. Excellent. Sirius, is Nimmy at Hogwarts? Or on another job? She was at the ministry. Contact Minister Bones and tell her you and I would consider it a great favor if she were to assign Nimmy to assist Mad Eye today, to shadow him all day as a learning experience. She's still a trainee. No getting sent off to do other tasks by anyone, including Mad Eye. She's to keep her wand at hand. If he asks why, she can say, constant vigilance. And cite the many visitors at Hogwarts as being the perfect opportunity for a Death Eater to sneak in unsuspected. Tell her it's vital. We can't explain just yet, but I'll owe them both a favor if she does this. Tell Minister Bones, remember Quirrell. Put on your Wizenmaggot's robes so she'll know you're serious, Sirius. Sirius nodded, grinning at the word play, and hurried out. Several minutes later, they heard him use the flow. Gary concentrated on eating without stabbing himself with his knife or fork. His results were mixed, but left Belle in giggles and the other three adults with worried frowns. Shortly after Creature cleared the table, except for one plate of food under a stasis charm for Sirius, he returned. Okay, done. She's mighty curious, but willing to cooperate. It's your show. He sat at his plate and started to eat. Gary took a careful sip of his tea, holding it with both hands. His coordination was improving by leaps and bounds, but he knew it would take several days before he was in any shape to have a duel. He would have to carefully hide that, though, he couldn't let his admiring public know he was under the weather. What's up? Sirius mumbled around a mouthful of food. Belle giggled, and shaking a finger at him with the other hand on her hip, said sternly, no talking with your mouth full. I think you need to go to your room for a few minutes, Belle, said Andromeda. She clearly wanted Belle not to hear the discussion. It's okay. Gary waved his hand. She can listen in. She won't tell anyone what we talk about here, will you, Belle? She shook her head, eyes wide at the show of confidence. Andromeda and Ted frowned, but didn't object farther. Gary sighed. I believe that Mad Eye has been replaced by a Death Eater taking polyjuice. Why? Came the obvious question from Remus. And why now instead of months ago? Gary looked down a moment. How did Harry's name get into the goblet of fire? He asked. The consensus was nobody knew. He nodded. Harry didn't enter his own name. There was an age line around the goblet, right? Among other things, Sirius replied. He looked them all in the eye, one at a time. I know Harry would never have submitted his name, especially after Hermione told him what happened to past champions. He's brash, but not terminally stupid. And he would only risk his life if someone else was in danger. And the prize money, he has more than that as pocket change in the summers. They exchanged looks, but overall agreed with him. It took a powerful wizard to not only get around the protections, but to confudo the goblet into allowing a fourth name to appear. That leaves out any but the adults. Harry certainly couldn't have done it. While it's possible one of the regular professors was suborned, it is highly unlikely one of the other professors would have noticed his or her inconsistencies in behavior. Not to mention the difficulty in getting to one of them. So, of the adults, the only new ones are Mad-Eye and the two visiting heads from the other schools. I doubt the heads of the other schools because of the difficulty in getting to them, and their students would notice as well. And the Death Eater connections on the continent are much more nebulous and reluctant to work on anything but a sure thing. He looked over at Sirius. Yes, Snape and Karkaroff are Death Eaters, but both have much to lose if Voldemort comes back, too much to want him to return. Karkaroff because Voldy will kill him, and Snape, well, Snape has his reasons. Mad-Eye, though, he's the unknown. Nobody at Hogwarts knows him well enough to notice any mistakes he might make in his performance. He looked over to Remus, and wasn't there something about him thinking he was being attacked just before school started? Remus nodded. The perfect cover for a substitution. They attack and subdue him, pull out a hair, and drop it in Polyjuice. Then when the Aurors show up, act paranoid and confused. Later, interrogate the real Mad-Eye using Veritaserum on everything he knows. He goes to Hogwarts in Mad-Eye's place and no one suspects a thing. He looked around at them. He's in the perfect position to manipulate everyone to get the desired outcome. Bloody hell. I bet McGonagall selected him as one of the guards to watch the goblet that night. He's a professor, so getting an assignment with Harry's name written on it is a no-brainer. 3 seconds in the dead of night when no one else is even on the ground floor, he casts a Confutus on the goblet and drops the scrap of paper into the goblet, and Bob's your uncle. I mean, who would suspect the renowned Mad-Eye Moody of forcing Harry Potter, someone he has never previously met, into the tournament? And, perhaps even worse, the Death Eaters who organized this now know every DMLE secret, and quite a bit more in the Ministry, not to mention every security detail about the tournament, and no one suspects. They exchanged appalled looks. The problem is proving it. He sighed. Here's the plan I have so far. Andromeda, Ted, you keep an eye on Little Miss Mischief here. He pointed at Belle, who assumed a look of, who? Me, innocence. Remus, Sirius, Nimmy, and I will tackle Mad-Eye. He looked at the werewolf. Remus, get a flask similar to Mad-Eye's except with a sleeping draught in it. When you see him pull out his flask, perform the switching charm on the contents after he takes a drink. He looked at the others, then we check the contents of Remus' flask. If, as I suspect, we smell Polyjuice, then we know we have Death Eater. And once again the illustrious Gilderoy Lockhart, Order of Merlin, 3rd class, honorary member of the Dark Force Defense League, 6-time winner of Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award, Hogwarts' beloved defense against the dark arts professor, slayer of basilisks, and detector of dark wizards has saved the day. He flashed them all one of his toothy confident smiles. He was slightly disappointed to see his audience wasn't impressed. He cleared his throat. If we don't, then we have pulled the greatest prank on Mad-Eye anyone has ever seen. Better it thought a prank than that Gary wasn't the perfect wizard that he was. Nobody laughed. If he detects the switch, stun him immediately. Otherwise, we wait until we can catch him unawares in a relatively open space, and stun him. And then we wait for the Polyjuice to wear off. He looked around them again. If I'm wrong, I'll make apologizes about the prank all around. Nimmy will be fine because Bones agreed to let her follow my orders. We'll pay a few fines, and then we'll begin to go through the school looking for the Death Eater. It shouldn't be that hard. With Snape's help we can find the culprit in a few hours, at most." He grimaced. "If he doesn't flee when he hears what happened with Moody." He looked back at Sirius. "This is why Nimmy is so important. She'll be following him all day, so he shouldn't be expecting her to stun him. If he does, then while he's dueling with her, the rest of us will take him down. You have to make sure she understands that if he goes to take a sip from his flask and stops, for any reason, stun him immediately." He scanned their faces. Any thoughts? Questions? They decided the best time to do it was when he likely would be most distracted, when Harry was taking his turn. With that settled, they trooped into the sitting room and flew to the 3 broomsticks. While they walked up to Hogwarts, Sirius tried to fill Gary in on what had happened that summer. Because Gary was still a bit unsteady on his feet, Sirius still thought he should go to St. Mungo's. Gary simply said, "This is far too important. I can go afterwards if necessary." Gary was relieved to find out that he had not spilled any secrets over the summer. He had mentioned being in Albania for research and that he had run afoul of an attack, but professed to not know the reason why. Once he recovered, he had devoted himself to finishing restraining a rat, which now had a release date of this spring. And annoying the hell out of both Remus and Sirius with his incessant self-aggrandizing. He had had his family visit for a week at Grimmauld Place just to meet Harry Potter and Belladonna. Sirius was rather surprised at the interest Harry had taken in the little girl, making sure she was happy and doing well in her new home. Her taking to pranking had endeared her the hearts of both Sirius and Remus. The Tonks weren't nearly as impressed with the pranking but agreed that the girl was a joy to behold, although she did have a temper. Harry adored her, and she adored him in turn. Harry, Hermione, Susan, Hannah, Luna, and Neville had become quite the troupe. That meant his family had met Hermione, Luna, Neville, Susan, Hannah, Ginny, Ron, Fred, and George when they came over for the Wednesday movie matinees, which they had resumed as soon as summer started. The pure bloods, it seemed, had dearly missed seeing the movies. And Belle had discovered Disney cartoons and become an instant fan. Ron came just to see the movies and for the free food. He mostly stayed away from Harry and Hermione, but at least was cordial. Belle had apparently overheard the twins talking with Harry or Hermione about their telly project and decided she wanted a home theater at Grimmauld Place. Fred and George had learnt that having a 7-year-old eagerly nagging them daily, if not hourly, "Is it done yet? Is it done yet?" provided a great incentive. They finished their working prototypes of a magic-resistant VCR and telly early in the summer. Belle now watched at least 1 movie a day. The movies became her reward for doing her tutor's assignments, which she blew through like a tornado. Everyone except Gary had declared her a hidden genius. Gary knew the truth. That she was merely relearning what she already knew through muscle memory. He simply said she was a hard worker. The playroom on the 2nd floor was now the movie room. And Sirius and Remus were helping the twins develop a business plan for introducing both items to the wizarding world. They hoped to open their first store in Diagon Alley the coming summer. And that was also why Remus wasn't still teaching the DADA, he was too busy working on investment fund projects to return to Hogwarts. Whatever had happened, despite falling back into his old self-aggrandizing habits, at least Gary had kept his secrets. The only comment that worried Gary was the one Sirius made about being relieved that the other, Gilderoy, was back. If that were the only complaint Gary heard, he would be happy. They arrived mid-morning. After saying hello to Headmistress McGonagall, they returned to the entryway to admire the Founder's artifacts. Gary was pleased to see the display case for them prominently placed, with large plaques describing each of the items and mentioning Gilderoy's part in their recovery. His name could have been larger in the individual plaques, he decided, but the single large plaque announcing that it was only thanks to Gilderoy Lockhart that these items were on display was sufficient, he concluded, nodding his satisfaction. When no one was looking, he added a few words of his own to the case to prevent any pilferage. And to make his picture a bit more central to the display with a special spell that drew people's eyes to his portrait. They met Harry and Hermione after his history of magic class. The 2 students had no other classes before lunch, so they wandered through the castle showing Belle some of its more interesting features, secret passages and hidden rooms, mainly. Naturally, His upcoming challenge kept the little wizard quite distracted, and he spent most of the time in a daze, following wherever Hermione led him by the hand. It was while they were showing Belle the hidden come-and-go room that Gary Lockhart stopped dead in the middle of the room and face-palmed himself. "What an idiot I am," he said. "Sirius, of course," added, "couldn't have said it better myself." Gary turned to Harry and said, "Harry, do you have the map?" "Map? You know, the map." Harry screwed up face, then said, "Oh, that map. No, it's in my trunk." The others, except Sirius and Remus, were looking at them as if they were mad. "You're right, Gil," Sirius said, grinning while Remus was chuckling beside him. "You are an idiot. Harry, this is very important, but I need you to get the map right now." Lockhart concentrated and a door appeared in one wall of the come-and-go room. He pointed. "That should take you straight to your common room and back. There's a notice me not on it for everyone in the common room but you. Hurry." A few minutes later Harry returned with the parchment. And moments later, they were crowded around the open Marauder's map. "There," the bee-owned-haired wizard said, as he pointed, "the DADA class, and it clearly says Yaxley, not Moody. I was right, and Moody," he pointed at a different spot, "is in his rooms." They exchanged looks. Yaxley was no pushover, he had certainly gotten the drop on Harry last spring. "Change of plans," said Gary. "We hit him in the Great Hall at lunch. We don't know when his schedule is for taking the potion, on the hour, half hour, or what. So, what we'll do is I'll meet him as his DADA class lets out and switch the flask contents." Sirius made a move to speak. "No, Sirius, everyone knows you fawn over Harry something awful, and he would be suspicious if you were there and not with Harry. And he would be equally suspicious of you, Remus." He smiled broadly. "I, on the other hand, will be anxious to meet the man teaching my students and make sure he is as good a professor as the great Gilderoy Lockhart, Hogwarts' most beloved defense against the dark arts professor." Rolling their eyes, Remus and Sirius reluctantly agreed. Remus handed over the flask. The dandy folded and placed the map in his pocket. "Now then, why don't you all head for the Great Hall while I waylay our victim?" Gary leaned casually against the corridor wall, waiting for the class to end. He could hear Mad Eye finishing up. Soon, the door burst open and the children poured out. It was a fifth-year class, and the first few through the door startled on seeing him. "Professor Lockhart," came the quick cry. Soon he was surrounded by his former students, especially the witches, asking how he was, what he was doing, and what did he think of the tournament. And the most popular by far was, "Do you remember me?" Laughing joyfully at their instant attention, he waved them off on their way to lunch, but several remained around him. He peeked in the door to see both Mad Eye and Nimmy standing at the desk, talking. Seeing him, Nimmy waved, her bubblegum pink hair turning briefly red. Mad Eye gave him a suspicious look. Together they started for door. Gary stepped back to give them room. "Mad Eye," he cried happily, "I've been looking forward to meeting you again." He would pretend to be a good friend of the suspicious old buzzard, that should throw the wizard off his stride. Yaxley would distance himself from Gary so as not to make a mistake and give himself away. "As long as I was here today I had to stop by and make sure that my former students were getting the best education possible, while you are a highly qualified or I am, after all, a world-class adventurer." Moody eyed him disapprovingly. "I certainly don't need your help." "Excellent," cried Gary, and put his arm around the old orer. Mad Eye smoothly stepped back. Gary pretended not to notice, stepping closer to follow the wizard and his arm still touching the other wizard's shoulders. Mad Eye again stepped back, this time starting to get angry. He didn't notice Gary's other hand snaking out to grab his flask from his pocket. Gary took a quick step away towards Nimmy and held up the flask. "You know, Mad Eye, you never did tell me what you put in this." Nimmy's eyes shot wide open. No one had ever tried to pickpocket the paranoid wizard's flask. No one had ever managed to get that close. Mad Eye made a startled grab for the flask. Gary held it away. "What's in it?" "Water. Butterbeer." He paused for a dramatic second and smirked. "Fire whiskey." He started to reach for the cap to open the flask. "Gimme that, you pompous fool," growled Mad Eye, this time successfully yanking the flask out of Lockhart's unresisting hands. He shoved it back into his pocket. Gary grinned. "Got you that time, you old buzzard," he said, chuckling. He yelled, "Constant vigilance." He bowed, sweeping his arm down the corridor. "After you, Professor Moody." The irate Orr stomped off, mumbling and growling, keeping to one side of the corridor, that farthest from Gary. Nimmy and Gary followed a moment later, with Gary's entourage giggling and laughing at Gary getting the drop on the prickly old paranoid wizard. Gary pulled out the map and pointed at Mad Eye, then pointed at the map where his and Nimmy's names appeared. He made sure his finger covered his name, leaving only the last part, Lockhart, showing. He didn't want to give away his secret, too. She looked at the map and the names around hers on it, then at the name following the footsteps in front of her. Her head shot up to look at Gary. He nodded. She looked back down and then at Moody. Gary held a finger in front of his lips, indicating she should keep silent. He put the map away just before the paranoid old Orr glanced at them. He waited a moment, then leaned close to her ear and quietly said, "Watch for my lead. If he stops in the middle of taking a drink from his flask and looks suspicious, stun him. Don't let anyone interfere, and for Merlin's sake, pay attention during the meal. Remember, Bones said to follow my orders." She nodded, hesitantly. Gary took a moment to look around when he entered the great hall. Harry and his friends were sitting at the Ravenclaw table. He was pleased to see that Hermione and Luna sat with Harry between them, with Neville sandwiched between Susan and Hannah. And Ron was far down the table, and sitting with Draco. What had happened in the last 5, almost 6, months? Maybe he didn't need to worry about Ron interfering with Harry and Hermione anymore. Across from them sat Sirius, Remus, and the Tonks with Belle. He was disappointed, but not surprised, to see that the "Harry Potter stinks" buttons were in evidence. Like last time, someone in Ravenclaw came up with the actual spells and charmed the buttons. He was pretty sure that Draco had nothing to do with them this time. Draco might have suggested it, but he wouldn't do anything to jeopardize his and his mother's position in the family. At the head of the hall, in front of the headmaster's table, were 2 other tables. Gary saw several press people, including Rita, at one, while the other had dignitaries from the UK Ministry and the other 2 schools' ministries. Excellent, a worldwide audience, he was pleased to note. Gary headed straight for Rita. "Rita, my love," he cried as he crouched down between her and Bozo's chairs before she even knew he was there. She jumped, startled, but turned a skeptical eye on him, raising an eyebrow. "Well," she said, dryly, "long time, no see." "Ah, you wound me," said Gary dramatically, placing his hand on his heart. "Don't worry though," he said in a conspiratorial whisper. "I have a sell-out story for you." He looked at Bozo. "Keep a close eye on Mad Eye, Bozo." He grinned at Rita's frowning face. "Trust me, Rita," he said much more quietly, almost in her ear. "This will put you on the front page for the rest of the week. The tournament will take a back seat to it." Her expression had changed to one of conniving, and she was already stealing glances at Moody as he sat not far from her at the headmaster's table. "Remember our deal with Harry Potter. Keep to it and I'll have an exclusive for you on his perspective of the tournament. And if you're really good, you might get an interview with his girlfriends." She gave him wide-eyed and very greedy look. "Yes, girlfriends as in plural. Things will happen when I start coughing." He moved over to sit at the front of the Ravenclaw table, among the 7th years, and facing Moody's seat at the headmistress' table. He wanted to be close when it all came together. He spent the next 40 minutes talking with his former students. This Moody wasn't as effective a teacher as his Moody had been during his Tri-Wizard. Fortunately, this Moody had skipped the Unforgivables lecture. Nimmy had taken a seat at the head of the Hufflepuff table, also facing Moody. Moody was fretting. Normally, the students told Gary, he took his meals in his rooms, but Headmistress McGonagall had insisted he attend this lunch as part of the festivities of the first task. He was picking at his dessert when he stopped and reached into his robes. Gary sent a quick mild stinging hex at Nimmy. She turned to look at him, scowling. He pointed with his chin at Moody. She spun in her seat. Her wand was already in her hand. Gary had palmed his as well. He started coughing loudly and stood, focusing attention on himself. Moody had already lifted the flask to his mouth. He took a quick sip. He made a face, and then frowned. He spit out what was in his mouth, but it was too late. That little bit of sleeping draft slowed his reactions. He started to throw himself backwards. Almost simultaneously, 2 stunners from Nimmy and Gary hit the oar. A second later, a third from the back of the hull hit the oar, probably Sirius. Moody slumped over in his chair. Pandemonium erupted in the hall. Nimmy was already hurrying around the headmistress' table. Gary took the easy route and jumped up on the Ravenclaw table. He almost fell as his muscles spasmed, a leftover from this morning. He casted an Incarcerus on the fake Moody. He decided to claim that his awkwardness was him dodging a possible response from the Death Eater. "Everyone calm down," he bellowed using a sonorous. "I, Gilderoy Lockhart, Order of Merlin, 3rd class, honorary member of the Dark Force Defense League, 6-time winner of Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award, Hogwarts' beloved former Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, slayer of basilisks, and detector of dark wizards, have once again saved the students of Hogwarts." Gary made himself lighter with the featherweight spell and delicately leapt from the Ravenclaw table to the headmistress' tabletop and in front of the fake Moody. The students, those that remembered him as a professor, promptly quieted down and shushed the younger years and visiting students. They remembered his other performances in the Great Hall, and this appeared to be just as entertaining. "This wizard is a fake," he continued. He cast a vanishing charm on the man's left sleeve. "He is a polyjuiced Death Eater." The students gasped. The adults began to deny the possibility. "That's mad. Impossible. Are you mad?" Minister Bones had warned her security detail to allow Gilderoy to act without interference. Only Gilderoy's past performance at delivering surprisingly effective results had convinced her to give him this much latitude. If he couldn't back up his claim, he would be in deep shite for an attack on an Auror, even if he was retired. In the meantime, her security detail was covering her carefully with shields up and ready to hustle her out of the room at the first sign of movement towards her. She remained seated but held her wand firmly in hand. She pushed one Auror to the side to give her a better view. But now she was watching her Auror, Nymphadora Tonks, through narrowed eyes, and paying special attention to how she was taking this so seriously. Still a trainee, the witch was following through like a professional. And acting as if she had total confidence that Gilderoy was correct. She wasn't taking her eyes or wand off the old Auror, and had already removed both his main and backup wands, which totaled 4 wands, the minister noted with chagrin. Tonks had also acquioed the flask and 2 other nondescript items, probably portkeys. "Mr. Lockhart," said McGonagall, "what is the meaning of this?" She was standing, as was almost everyone at the headmistress' table. "Everyone quiet, please," Gary said, still using the sonorous. "Can everyone see me? Can everyone hear me?" He waited a bare moment for the noise level to drop. He smiled broadly, using his left hand to drape his robes elegantly to his side, shaking his head ever so slightly to make his hair wave dramatically. He turned to the headmistress. "I have incontrovertible proof that this wizard," he pointed at the bound old Auror, "is not Alistair, Mad-Eye, Moody, but is instead a polyjuiced Death Eater, one Phineas Yaxley." She stared at him a moment, then said, "Proctors, clear the hall." "Stop," interrupted Gary. He smiled at her broadly. "Would this not be a great opportunity for your students to see our wonderful ministry and Aurors in action? To see how the ministry conducts an investigation. To see an actual interrogation in action. To observe the extraordinary talents of myself, Gilderoy Lockhart, in person and not as something they read after the fact." She stared at him, eyes narrowed in suspicion. Slowly, she nodded. "Everyone," she said, her voice carrying over the hall easily, "return to your seats." She gave Gary a smirk. "Professor Lockhart has a lesson for us." Minister Bones cleared her throat. "We should take Mr. Moody back to the ministry for questioning," she stated. Gary looked down at her from the tabletop. "If you remove him, all sorts of awful rumors will appear and make life difficult for you in the ministry," he said quietly, "such as, that you are covering up facts to protect yourself." She, too, nodded slowly. He smiled broadly. "Professor Snape, would you be so good as to fetch some of your personal stock of Veritaserum?" The greasy-haired git stared at him, unmoving. The minister shook her head. You can't administer veritaserum without due cause. Gary grinned at her, confidently. No, we wait a few minutes. By the time Severus returns with the potion, you will see a Death Eater impersonating a retired Auror, using that person's reputation to procure the position of professor at Hogwarts, and thus gaining access to 1,000 of England's best students for who knows what nefarious deeds. That is a crime of the first degree, if I am not mistaken. That he is the one responsible for entering Mr. Potter into the Triwizard Tournament raises the crime to that of an international incident. I'm sure not even the Wizenmaggots can gainsay the use of veritaserum when it is likely he has interfered with the first task and 4 lives are at risk at a minimum, 2 of them invited foreign visitors. She sat silent for a minute, before saying, on my authority as Minster for Magic, I authorize the use of veritaserum in this instance. Gary turned to Snape and raised an eyebrow. Snape looked at McGonagall, who said, Go, Severus. Gary levitated the phony Moody to the headmistress, tabletop, with his bare left arm facing the students. The room settled to a soft buzz as the students started whispering and talking quietly, only now realizing that their professor for the last 3 months might be a Death Eater. He began adopting various poses for Bozo, and the other photographers present, with the defeated Death Eater at his feet. Front page headlines, again. It had been quite a while since the last ones. He wanted only the best pictures to appear in the news parchments for his adoring public to admire. The whole hall let out a gasp when Moody began to bubble and his wooden leg fell to the floor as a real one took its place. The appearance of the Death Eater tattoo on his exposed arm brought a hurricane of whispers and not a few shrieks of horror as they realized the truth of Gilderoy's accusations. Snape paused only a moment when he arrived back at the headmistress' table and saw the Death Eater Yaxley where previously had been Moody. Snape hadn't really believed Gilderoy, but here was the proof. The veritaserum quickly provided the answers. Yes, he was a Death Eater. Yes, you had to take the mark willingly. Yes, he had tortured and killed a Muggle-born and his family to take it, as they all did. Yes, he had tricked the Goblet of Fire into choosing Harry. Yes, it was on orders from the Dark Lord. Yes, he meant Lord Voldemort. Yes, the Dark Lord was back. He was currently in a homunculus. Yes, he was seeking to acquire a full body. Yes, the Dark Lord wanted Harry for the ritual. They stopped the questioning at that point. Gary said, I think we've proved the point, don't you agree, Minister Bones? This is conclusively not Alistair Moody. Mr. Potter did not choose to enter the Triwizard Tournament. And, somehow, Voldemort intends to subvert this tournament. Perhaps a stronger Auror presence for the tasks would be in order. Grimly, the minister nodded. Perhaps we should involve some of the Aurors from both France and Bulgaria now that they know beyond the shadow of a doubt that their champions' lives are at risk from an outside force, he added in a speculative tone. Madame Olympe Maxime and High Master Professor Igor Karkaroff were both nodding their heads in agreement. Gary rubbed his hands together in a satisfied manner and grinning happily. Well, now that that's been all sorted, and speaking of the tournament, Headmistress McGonagall, perhaps we should dismiss the students so we can all watch the first task. He smiled brilliantly, and then hopped down to the floor beside the reporters. He hoped no one noticed his slight stumble. He still hadn't entirely recovered his balance. Lockhart leaned over to Rita and whispered, the first task is dragons. I have no doubt Harry will put on a spectacular performance for us. If you ask nicely, I'm sure that you could get several students, perhaps even Harry's girlfriends, Miss Granger and Miss Lovegood, to provide you with comprehensive memories of the task while you prepare an article for this evening's Daily Prophet about what we just saw. And steal a march on all the other news parchments. She gave him a startled look, then grinned. She grabbed Bozo and whispered into his ear. The photographer nodded. She hustled out of the great hall on her way to Hogsmeade in a flow. Yaxley, under heavy Auror guard, left for a holding cell. Minister Bones left to deal with the issues of his proper interrogation. The students trailed out of the hall and towards the task viewing stands. Fear not, Harry, the Gary told the nervous student as they slowly headed over to the champion's tent, his friends following, stunned at the revelations they had just heard. You will do fabulously. When you hop on your broom all your doubts will melt away. The first task started an hour late, at 3 instead of 2. Minister Bones refused to let them start until she had what she felt was an adequate force of oars in place. And it took time to gather them from off work and other assignments. Where there had been just a few oars for crowd control, there were now easily 100 oars and trainees scattered around the viewing stands and Hogwarts grounds. As Gary remembered, Cedric went first, Fleur second, and Crumb third. And they drew the same dragons. It only now occurred to Gary that he should have asked if Yaxley had charmed the bag holding the models. As the paranoid Moody, it would have been in character for Yaxley to demand to check the bag, and thus ensure that Harry drew the worst of the bunch. Oh, well, it was too late now. The differences, though, thanks to the potions secretly supplied by Sirius, were that Cedric and Fleur escaped with only their robes slightly singed. Crumb, however, still used the conjunctivitis curse and lost points for the destruction of the other eggs in the nest. Harry performed almost exactly as he remembered doing, exhibiting flying skills that drew admiring remarks from Bagman and gasps from the crowd. This time, though, when the dragon's tail slid along his shoulder, all it did was tear the boy wizard's robes and left him unmarked. That didn't prevent Gary from flinching slightly at the remembered pain. In the end, the rankings were Harry, Fleur, Cedric, and Crumb. The first three were differentiated merely by their times, not to mention the biased scoring by the Master Karkaroff. Afterwards, as the family was congratulating the stunned Harry on his success, Headmistress McGonagall came up to Gary. She studied him, smiling for a moment. She had a gleam in her eye that he didn't like. Before he could burst into his normal, that is, self-aggrandizing spiel to the audience that was quickly forming around them, she said, "Well, Professor Lockhart, because you have managed to deprive Hogwarts of its DADA. Professor so early in the year, it seems only fitting that you should take his place. Especially given your previous experience in that position. I'll expect to see you tomorrow morning, bright and early." She grinned even wider at his startled expression. But he needed to figure out what happened, and why the last 6 months were so fuzzy. And why was Gilderoy so quiet? And he had so many things to do, to prepare, to find Voldemort, and circumvent his plans. And he still needed to finish examining the final proofs on restraining a rat. That, naturally, would be taking most of his attention for the next few days. Why, thank you, Minerva, that's a generous offer. But I should think that the real Alistair Moody should take that position. While I dislike depriving your students of the wonderful education I could provide. He paused a beat but decided to skip his "I'm the great Gilderoy" spiel. He continued instead with, "It simply would not be fair to the wizard to do otherwise." For some reason a look of dread crossed the headmistress' face during his brief pause, followed by relief at his just continuing his sentence. "You did search his rooms and find the real Moody hidden inside his trunk with all the polyjuice supplies, correct?" She nodded sadly. "Madame Pomfrey says it will take several weeks for him to recover. And even then, he won't be up to the demands of a full-time position as the DADA professor. So," she looked at him intently, "I expect to see you here tomorrow for your classes, bright and early." She gave him a broad smile, turned, and headed over to talk with French minister, presumably regarding coordinating with his Aurors for the next task. He stared after her, ignoring the congratulations his admirers were giving him. She could have said something anytime that afternoon, but she had waited until now. He frowned. Had the headmistress just pranked him? He snorted. Well, that had been unexpected. He smiled broadly, and turned his attention to his fangirls, his admiring public, and began to troll. Hey, he meant extol, how exceptional his teaching skills were to the crowd around him. Signing a few autographs was not unexpected and helped improve his disposition. Lockhart reread his parchment, studying it as he headed downstairs from the study. Second task. Open egg underwater to hear message. They put someone important to the champion in the Mervillage under the lake. Champion has 1 hour to rescue them. Hostages are safe. I, Gilderoy Lockhart, will be in village to monitor the hostages. Warn Fleur's father that they will take her sister. A fire creature underwater without precautions. What are they thinking? Solution has 2 parts. First, breathing underwater, gillyweed, bubble charm, transfiguration to underwater creature, or Muggle scuba gear. Second, finding and getting to hostage and back to land in under an hour. Conjure or transfigure from dock. A boat and use point me spell to above village, and then dive straight down with a heavy rock and back with conjured muggle face mask and flippers. Instead of boat, Accio broom. Can brooms fly underwater? And it went on for a bit more. Yes, that would do. He walked into the dining room and dropped the parchment at his normal place setting on the table. He would reread it after supper. It was fun trying to think how he would solve the problem, knowing what he now knew. What would be easiest, what would be fastest, what would cause the most consternation among the watching crowd. He stared at the parchment. He really should take it with him because Sirius might come in and see it. Remus wouldn't share the information if he saw it, but Sirius. In a second. But Sirius was in the game room upstairs, and he just needed a few minutes to make a flow call to Headmistress McGonagall. He wouldn't take too long as supper should be soon. He left it flat on the table as he went into the sitting room to make his flow call. Headmistress McGonagall, he called. They had returned home after the task, leaving Harry and Hermione to attend the raucous party the twins were sure to throw. It was after supper at Hogwarts and he expected her to be at her desk with paperwork, especially after the day's events. She was. Could you get me a copy of my class schedules? Or is it the same as when I taught? It took her only a few minutes to provide him an updated schedule. It was mostly the same as his first year as a professor, with only a few minor changes to accommodate the foreign students. The Beauxbatons and Durmstrang students had classrooms in the West Wing for the professors who had come with them to teach their school-specific subjects that were not taught at Hogwarts, but he did have an extra few classes just for them. The French minister has told me, she said, that we can expect to see the foreign Aurors arriving tomorrow. She shook her head sadly. To think this is necessary. My dear, Gary Gilderoy said, never fear, I, Gilderoy Lockhart, Order of Merlin, 3rd class, honorary member of the Dark Force Defense League, 6-time winner of Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award, Hogwarts' beloved defense against the dark arts professor, slayer of basilisks and detector of dark wizards am here. Nothing shall escape me. The Aurors are merely to assure outsiders that all is well. I will be the real protection for the students. He could see her restraining herself from rolling her eyes. He twinkled his eyes at her. He was so glad he had finally found that spell. We know that if anything happens I shall easily forestall any harm to any students, as I always have. He smiled brilliantly. Just read my books for the details and proof. She looked down at her desk and cleared her throat. Yes, well, hopefully that shan't be necessary. In any case, I have another request. She looked at him questioningly. Do you mind if I install a swimming pool in the dungeons? Swimming pool. She looked at him in consternation. Yes, it occurs to me that not all dark creatures and monsters are above water, and while I am an accomplished adventurer, it is rather difficult to get across to the children just how different a matter it is when one is below the surface. Never mind the immediate problem of breathing, but how does one accomplish spells? The reducto is a mere annoyance underwater unless one puts a ridiculous amount of power into it. The water rapidly degrades the spell's performance. And without appropriate precautions beforehand, spells underwater can be as deadly to oneself as to one's opponent. For example, a powerful bombardo is a quick route to suicide. It would be a good experience for the children in DADA to see how water affects their spells. Not to mention being able to encounter the underwater creatures in their native environment. It is one thing to see a Grindylow in a fish tank and quite another to have a horde of them chasing you. Plus, it would be an excellent opportunity for them to meet the merpeople on an equal footing, as it were. Being in the dungeons, it shouldn't be that difficult to arrange a tunnel to the lake to facilitate such meetings. She blinked a few times, thinking, a wonderful idea, Gil, but we haven't a budget to install such a thing. And it would take months, if not years, to push through the funding from the ministry. He waved his wand dismissively. Not an issue. I'll simply call in a few favors from my fans and it'll all be taken care of. Okay, she said hesitantly. If you think you can do it, by all means go right ahead. Excellent. This will be so much more exciting than my trip to Albania last spring. Quote. He spent another 5 minutes telling her about how boring that adventure had been. Why most of the villagers there had never even heard of Gilderoy Lockhart, nor his fabulous adventures as chronicled in his books. And how he had to work hard to maintain his perfect appearance at all times. He left out his violent encounter with Volduhor in Yaxley. She didn't ask about his subsequent stay in St. Mungo's, so perhaps she didn't know of it. He felt someone tap his shoulder. Oops, I'm wanted at this end, so I'll see you tomorrow at breakfast, then. Goodbye, he called out cheerily. He pretended not to notice her relieved expression as he said that. He had far too much political and financial pull for her to risk offending him. Not that Gary really cared. She could be as rude as she wanted and he wouldn't bat an eyelash, but she didn't know that. He pulled back from the flow and sat a moment, getting his balance back. It was Dobby at his side. Supper is served. Thank you, Dobby, he said, standing and straightening his robes. He sedately returned to the dining room. Already sitting around the table were the Tonks, Belle, Remus, and Sirius. Folded on his place setting was his parchment of notes. Sirius had the most innocent expression. If you didn't know him, you wouldn't suspect he had been reading something he knew he shouldn't. Gary was relieved to see, from the glare that Remus was giving Sirius, that Remus had managed to keep the parchment safe from prying eyes. He nodded to himself in approval. No one could claim, now that he was a professor again, that he had deliberately helped Harry. That night, as Gary was finishing putting his hair curlers in place for the night, he had to look his best for the first day of his new classes. He realized it was awful quiet in the back of his mind. Normally, well, ever since the incident in Flourish and Blots, there had been the constant murmuring of Harry's thoughts and the swell and ebb of his emotions. He assumed that when Harry was in charge, then he felt the same effects from Gilderoy. But right now, there was dead silence. It was rather unnerving, actually. He hadn't noticed earlier because the pain on awakening and then the hectic activity during the day. But now, as he was relaxing in the rather mindless actions of preparing for bed, he could pay attention to what was in his own head, and it seemed to be rather empty. Where had Gilderoy disappeared to? It was just Sue, quiet. Everything up to the last 6 months was distinct in his memory. He could clearly demarcate when he was in control and when Gilderoy was. Gilderoy, it had seemed, was more than willing to let Harry do most of the work, and only insisted on being in control when the subject of his books came up. He had been quite happy to let Harry deal with the physical issues of spell casting and battle tactics. And Harry was more than willing to let Gilderoy do his writing and rewriting. And rewriting, and then rewriting it again. It was a lot of work writing a book, Harry had discovered. And something he hadn't considered ever doing himself. Watching Gilderoy agonize over whether that last sentence delivered what he wanted the reader to experience was, well, mind-boggling to Harry. He spent that time in planning and meditating and tried not to think about the book. On the other hand, watching Harry zip through difficult-to-cast spells almost without thinking was beyond amazing to Gilderoy. Watching as he cast powerful spell after powerful spell without any signs of fatigue was simply astonishing to the previously mediocre wizard. Spells that would have left Gilderoy staggering and barely able to stay awake after casting them, Harry shot off without any noticeable after effect. And did them repeatedly. And yet where was he? Where was Harry? No, where was Gilderoy? Wait, who was in control here? Gary stared at his reflection. And his reflection stared back. Was he looking at Harry? Or Gilderoy? What had the spell been meant to do to him back last spring? And what had it done? He couldn't detect Harry in his mind anymore, yet he could remember everything Harry had experienced and done, as well as everything he had felt emotionally. And the same was true for Gilderoy. But there was no longer a wall between them. There was no sense that if he simply relaxed and mentally said the equivalent of, here, that Gilderoy would take over and he could concentrate on thinking and planning while Gilderoy did what Harry thought of as drudge work. His memories no longer consisted of Harry looking at Gilderoy's childhood with envy nor Gilderoy looking in horror at Harry's experiences. Instead, they were all his point of view, they had all happened to him, and not to Gilderoy or Harry. And his mental point of view kept flipping, making things even more confusing. One moment he was positive he was Gilderoy and the next that he was Harry. Perhaps he was both. Had Voldemort's spell, obviously meant to destroy Harry mentally, instead instigated their complete integration. Gary decided he would go into an occlumency trance and examine the insides of his skull for a while, and if that didn't provide any substantial clues, go to bed. "Good morning, class," Lockhart called out cheerily as the fourth-year Gryffindors and Slytherins finished seating themselves. It was his first class of the day. He stood at the front of the class with his robes artfully held back by his hands on his hips, teeth gleaming brightly in a broad smile, nodding acknowledgments to the female students as they filed in and noticed their idol waiting for them. Today was a plum day, he had decided, and he looked stunning, even if he said so himself. He had redecorated the room, rather tastefully, he thought, using his store of Lockhart portraits. There were only about 24 on the walls, all of them happily waving and giving the students the thumbs-up sign. There was that blank spot over there. How had he missed it? He would have to add a few more portraits from his trunk. Harry and his friends regarded him somewhat warily. As you probably know, it had been announced at breakfast, your former DADA professor was a Death Eater pretending to be Alistair Moody, and has been removed, by moi, of course, he said not so modestly. I am, of course, Gilderoy Lockhart. He held up the cover of the soon-to-be-released Restraining a Rat with his smiling, happy face. On it, Order of Merlin, 3rd class, honorary member of the Dark Force Defense League, 6-time winner of Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award, Slayer of Basilisks, Detector of Dark Wizards, and, as you all remember, Hogwarts' most beloved defense against the dark arts professor. And, in view of your former professor now being in ministry custody, the headmistress has wisely chosen me to finish out your education this year. He grinned broadly at the class, making sure his gleaming teeth were on display. There were sighs of dismay from many of the boys, and sighs of contentment from all the girls. He dropped the book back on his desk with a loud bang, the Gilderoy on the cover winching in response. He rubbed his hands together gleefully as he went, "Muah-ha-ha-ha-ha." In his best Muggle-mad scientist impression, he had spent over an hour last night practicing it. He hoped the little buggers appreciated it. "You're mine, now." Harry and company definitely were alarmed, now. Well, except for Hermione, she looked as if she were about to have an orgasm. "I looked over your course materials and you seem to be right where you are supposed to be." Unfortunately, he broadened his smile as many of the students started to look alarmed. They remembered his packed course material from second year when he had worked them relentlessly. They had had excellent grades as a result, but still, it had been quite tiring. "Put your books and bags away, we're going to see just how good your practicals are." He spun around with a flourish and wandlessly moved his desk and chair to the wall. Spinning back to face the class, he shot a quick stunner at Harry. As he had expected, the boy already had his wand up and a shield appeared to reflect the spell to the ceiling. "Constant vigilance," Lockhart cried happily. 5 points to Mr. Potter for being prepared. For the class it seemed as if the next 2 hours passed in minutes as he put them through their paces. "Terrible," he exclaimed just before class let out. "You're right where you should be." They stared back, appalled. "Have no fear, though. I, Gilderoy Lockhart, Order of Merlin, 3rd class, honorary member of the Dark Force Defense League, 6-time winner of Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award, Slayer of Basilisks, Detector of Dark Wizards, and your beloved defense against the dark arts professor will have you ready for your owls by then end of the year." The class goggled at him, stunned. But, owls are next year," cried one horrified soul. "Ron," he thought. Lockhart laughed. "And what's wrong with being ahead? Everyone will underestimate you, giving you a definite advantage in any sort of confrontation. Plus, this will give you more time to concentrate on your other subjects next year and your DADA time will be merely revising. That and getting a head start on your NEWTs so your final years won't be as exhausting." Several of the students with siblings having gone through NEWTs nodded their agreement. 3 years to learn what they needed for the Dada NEWTs would be much better than the cramming that took place trying to do it in 2. Hermione was nodding eagerly while the rest of the class divided into 2 groups, one of resigned acceptance and the other of horror at the work involved. "By the way," he added, "I am installing an Olympic-sized pool in the dungeon's west wing so that we may get up close and personal with the denizens of the watery realm." There was a stunned silence. And to teach those who don't know how to swim. The pool will be open for recreational use by students all school year from 6 in the morning until curfew, except when in use by DADA and care of magical creatures classes, which times will be posted in your common rooms and in the pool room. He didn't mention the alarm on the room that went to the Dada professor's room in the event anyone tried to enter it after curfew. The house elves also monitored the room at all times so there wouldn't be any drowning tragedies. A spell of his own devising prevented anyone from entering the pool if there were no professors or house elves to provide oversight. The class broke up into furious whispering as those students familiar with public pools explained to the others what was going on. Class dismissed. Mr. Potter, a brief moment of your time, please. Hermione, Neville, Susan, Hannah, and Ron waited just outside the door as Harry approached Lockhart's desk. Ron was more to the edge of the group instead of being right up with Hermione. Perhaps he was finally getting a handle on his jealousy. Harry, my boy, I haven't had a chance to get together with you and it looks as if things are rather busy for you and me right now. So, I wanted to tell you, he said quietly, I haven't been myself since returning from Albania, but yesterday I guess you could say I woke up. He sighed. If I had been truly awake, I would have been able to prevent this whole fiasco with the Tri-Wizard tournament, and I apologize for not doing that. He shook his head sadly, looking down at the floor for a moment, inwardly cursing himself for his overconfidence in dealing with Voldemort in Albania. He should have expected there to be a dedicated follower nearby. He should have planned for the Death Eater to have competent backup. The future Harry Potter for sure would have expected a trap before setting out and made accommodations accordingly. His successes of the previous 2 years had given him a false sense of security and assuredness, a feeling that he could make no mistakes. Well, he had paid for that mistake, and so had Harry, to a lesser degree, by ending up in the Tri-Wizard tournament. Harry smiled at him, warmly. It's okay, you've more than made up for anything wrong you might have done with getting my godfather free and taking in Bella. Sometimes you might be a right prat, but I know you mean well. The older wizard raised his eyebrows in surprise. Apparently, important things had happened between them over the last half a year. Thank you, Harry, Gary said gratefully. He frowned. I'm sorry to say that I don't remember much of the last 6 months, so if I say or do something unusual, please forgive me. It was Harry's turn to frown. Nothing to worry about, my boy, Lockhart said. Now, you need to contact Sirius about the next task. He has information for you. Not being a professor or otherwise involved in the tournament, he can provide you with assistance. Harry nodded. Sirius' help with the first task had been indispensable. He smiled at the shorter wizard. Now, run along. Harry left quickly, and Lockhart was pleased to see that he grabbed Hermione's hand as they set off down the corridor while Luna, who had arrived in the meantime, took his other hand. Astonishingly, Draco was also outside in the corridor and walked beside Ron as the group headed for their dinner before afternoon classes. Gone was his typical sneer and he and Ron appeared to be quite amicable. Had Gary hit the nail on the head 2 years ago? He shook his head ruefully. The rest of the week passed quickly as Gary quickly assessed the different classes. They were all where he expected. He previously brought them all to the point where they exceeded the school's requirements the last time he was here, and Remus hadn't let them fall behind last year. The exceptions, of course, were the first and second year's students who hadn't been in attendance back then. It would take only a little work to bring them up to snuff, and then move them ahead. The underwater portions he had planned would add a small bit to the course material, but not anything that would drastically affect the schedule. He foresaw the pool becoming a rich recreational resource during the cold winter months, which would decrease some of the tension of 1,000 students trapped inside a snowbound edifice. Not to mention getting Harry the help he needed with the second task while hiding it as course material for the entire school. And the pranking opportunities were limitless. First, there were the reactions the conservative wizards would have to their first sight of the bikinis that Gary was sure the Muggle-born witches would rapidly introduce to the pool. Those would provide much amusement. The pure-bloods only thought the current Wizarding World one-piece swimsuits were revealing. And he could hardly wait to see the witches' response to a wizard in a Speedo. And then there were the spells he had built into the pool room that occasionally would turn the 7th year class's suits transparent while underwater or wet. Not too much, nor for too long. Just enough to rile both genders. Oh, this year was going to be so much fun. Mademoiselle Delacour, if you would come down here please, Lockhart called out after his introduction to the 7th year DADA class. This class was a mix of Bobadins, Durmstrang, and Hogwarts students. The foreign students were all giving him looks of disbelief and disdain, obviously considering him little more than a dandy, especially after seeing the room's decorations. He so loved it when people underestimated him, it made it so much more satisfying when he trounced them later on. The Hogwarts students, though, from previous experience 2 years ago, regarded him with well-deserved respect. They remembered him as the eccentric magical powerhouse with impressive teaching skills that he truly was. The beautiful half-witch reluctantly, but elegantly, stood and started to the front of the room. The Bobadin student's robes marvelously showed off her hypnotizing figure as she walked down to join Lockhart at the front of the class. She was the epitome of grace in motion. Now, then, most of you know that Miss Delacour, here, is a half-Vila. He gave her a broad smile. Who can tell me what that means? Several students raised their hands. Господин Polyakov. The Durmstrang student stood beside his desk. They are a race of semi-human, semi-magical creatures, he sneered. Their looks and dance are magically seductive to males. When angry, they transform into bird-like creatures and can launch balls of fire from their hands. They are easily angered, he added distastefully. They can breed with wizards. He managed to sound outraged at that thought. An excellent summary. Gary shook his head slightly to flounce his hair. He figured the Durmstrang student must be a closet gay as who wouldn't want to breed with the stunningly beautiful creature now standing beside him at the front of the classroom. Based on Bill Weasley's appearance in the morning the few times Gary had visited them at Shell Cottage, it was an experience well worth the effort. Mademoiselle Durand, can you add anything to that? It is unknown if half-Vila or part-Vila can be male with the same abilities as female part-Vilas. They experience a great deal of hostility from wizards and witches. It is unknown at what generation part-Vila lose their ability to transform. Excellent. Now then, Mademoiselle Delacour, can you selectively target your allure? She frowned prettily, but reluctantly nodded. Oui. A bit. Volunteers, please. He paused only long enough to take a breath. You, and you. The indicated students, 2 wizards and 2 witches, shaking their heads at their poor luck in being selected, came to the front of the class and stood to his left while the half-Vila was to his right. In short order, Lockhart had Fleur demonstrate the effects of her allure. The witches were upset and annoyed at the wizards while the wizards wore dazed expressions and couldn't take their eyes off the young part-Vila. Several seated students closest to her also showed the effects. That included one girl Lockhart was interested to notice. Lockhart then attempted several different protective shields, placing them between the half-Vila and himself and his test subjects. Well, isn't that interesting? There does not appear to be any magical barrier capable of protecting oneself from the allure. He grinned at the class. You are either resistant or you are not. He put his left hand on his hip, showing off. Naturally, a great wizard such as myself is easily capable of resisting even a full Vila's allure. Fleur gave him a sidelong glance. But what about physical barriers? They quickly determined that a wall of any kind, wood, stone, metal, cloth, anything that completely blocked sight of the half-witch would stop the allure. Glass did not, nor did cloth thin enough to allow some sight of the half-witch through, even if it was only a shadow. Well, isn't that interesting? This aspect Vila allure is an entirely sight-based magic. The only way to stop the allure is physically to block your sight of the Vila. Even just closing your eyes will stop it. He glanced around the room. Most students appeared surprised. Plus, the Vila allure is not infallible. Strong-minded wizards, such as myself, or those truly in love can resist it. Isn't that true, mademoiselle? He turned towards her, flashing his blinding bright smile at her. Oui. Fleur was completely blank-faced, even though he could feel her irritation and anger flowing out from her. The wizards are captivated by the allure, which makes them angry that they lost control, while the witches are angry because they are worried that they will lose their wizard to Avila, to competition they have no hope of overpowering or beating. And that is why many Vila are unfairly subjected to discrimination and dislike. He looked out across the class. Mademoiselle Vasseur, have you ever noticed that wizards spend more time talking to your chest than to you? The witch in question was quite well endowed. The Bobadans' robes did an excellent job of showcasing a witch's upper superstructure, even if there wasn't that much structure to showcase. Still, he appreciated the robe designer's attention to detail. She rolled her eyes. Most of the rest of the girls in the class giggled or nodded in agreement. Those nearly as well built as Mademoiselle Vasseur had exasperated expressions as well. Several of the boys looked embarrassed and snuck quick looks at the better endowed Bobadan students. The fact that wizards stare at your chest doesn't mean that you want them to do that, now does it? Non, came the quiet answer. Sometimes your chest tends to attract attention from wizards you really do not want to talk to, or even be seen talking to. Isn't that true as well? And isn't it true that in some cases you attract the attention of wizards you would really rather totally avoid? Especially those we tend to call lechers or beeps. She blushed while looking somewhat angry. And you have many witches who envy you your ability to attract wizards, many who resent you for that same ability, and many who dislike you, even though it's just an accident of birth that you have those buxom attributes. And many of those witches spread nasty rumors about you being a witch of loose morals because you can so easily capture the interest of any wizard just by loosening a button, don't they? Still blushing, she answered, sadly. And isn't it also true that most wizards seem to think that the larger a witch's chest is, the dumber she must be? Was the exasperated reply, seconded by several other witches who had larger than average mammary glands. So, one might say that you understand exactly how Avila feels about the attention she gets from wizards, isn't that so? Both witches exchanged a startled look before staring at Lockhart. Mademoiselle Vasseur, if you could attract and marry any wizard you wanted, would you pick an average, run-of-the-mill wizard, or the richest most powerful wizard you could find? She laughed. The rich one, of course. All the girls laughed at that. Lockhart looked out at the class, smiling broadly. So, then, ladies, none of you need worry about losing your wizard friend to Avila, unless your wizard friend is a rich and a magically powerful wizard, isn't that right? After all, if Avila can have any wizard, why should she settle for a weak pauper when she can have the richest and most powerful? The witches all had stunned looks that slowly changed to calculating as they stared at Fleur, who was staring at Lockhart in shock. Finally, Mademoiselle Vasseur, Lockhart said, who would you find more interesting? A wizard who simply stared at your chest all the time every time you met or went on a date, or a wizard who looked you in the eyes and actually listened to what you said? Who could actually hold an intelligent conversation with you on subjects you find interesting? She frowned and answered, the wizard who listened. Exactly, cried Lockhart triumphantly. So, ladies, the wizard Avila will find most interesting falls into one of two categories. Either he's the richest and most powerful wizard around, or he can resist the allure. A perfect match would be both, of course, such as myself, the famous Gilderoy Lockhart. He paused. He could see the Hogwarts students mentally finishing his spiel about his accomplishments. He grinned broadly. He had trained them well, he had. He continued, of the two, I'm sure that Mademoiselle Delacour, here, will tell you she is far more interested in finding a partner who she can talk with intelligently rather than a slobbering imbecile who can barely walk because he's too busy drooling on her shoes. After all, if you could have any wizard you wanted, which would you choose? The witches in class all had thoughtful expressions. The wizards looked mostly confused, probably an aftereffect of Fleur's allure. Or the fact that they were boys and basically incapable of understanding the problem at all. Mademoiselle Delacour, isn't it also true that the allure is difficult to control while you are young? So, while you are still learning to control your allure, just as wizards and witches are learning to control their magic, sometimes you won't be able to restrain it and wizards will succumb to its influence. They will follow you around like little lost puppies, with their tongues hanging out and drooling on the floor. Correct. The half-witch stared at him. She answered slowly. Gary turned back to the class. So, Ladies, if you see your wizard friend staring at Mademoiselle Delacour with a particularly blank look and you can't seem to break it, you know 3 things of vital importance. First, your wizard friend is not in love with you, no matter what he professes. That could change, but at that moment, it is not true. Explain that to him in small words, and don't say, "You know why I'm mad." I guarantee you, he doesn't. If you want to be snarky, give him a mop and bucket and tell him it's for his drool. Second, unless your wizard friend is very rich and magically powerful, you have nothing to fear from Mademoiselle Delacour. She's looking for someone who can easily resist her allure. In most cases that will be an older mature wizard. One who is confident in himself and his position. Neither do you have to fear her if your wizard friend is in love with you and able to resist her. Just because he's in love with you doesn't mean he could resist her if he were unattached. Plus, if he's truly in love with you, she knows she hasn't a chance of deflecting that love to herself. If she could deflect that love, then he wouldn't be able to resist her in the first place. And third, she's accidentally temporarily lost control of her allure. Please forgive her error. Trying to control her allure is a tiring job, and the longer her day is the more difficult it becomes. As a result, you are more likely to see such incidents in the late evening. As she gets older, that control will strengthen until it only affects those physically within a foot or so of her. Any male farther than her arm's reach is safe, unless he is particularly weak-minded. But for now, it is difficult for her. And finally, put your hand over his eyes or turn his head to look at you to break the connection. It might take a moment, but it will work. Another effective method is a good sharp kick to the shin. He paused, then added, "If you are particularly annoyed, aim higher." The wizards all made a reflexive winch at the thought of where that higher aim might be. Now, then, regarding her transformed form. When extremely angry or upset, Avila will transform into a bird-like creature capable to throwing devastating fireballs. The best defense against this is do not piss off Avila. Understand? He glared at the class. And if you ever do encounter a transformed Vila, run. While a shield such as Protega will stop a fireball or two, it will collapse fairly quickly under the barrage of fireballs she will fling your way. Gary turned and gave the young half-witch a beaming smile. You may return to your seat. Oh, would you mind attending my other classes later this week and repeating this lesson? I find live examples make a longer-lasting impression than a simple lecture. Give me your answer later today. With several uncertain glances back at him, she returned to her seat. What had just happened had not been what she expected when he had first started speaking. Gary knew he had just changed the young witch's life at Hogwarts. While some witches would ignore this lesson, at least a few would now understand and empathize with the Part-Vila, and perhaps be willing to befriend her. At the very least the amount of open hostility would drop. Later that day she sought him out and agreed to demonstrate her allure in his other classes. Rita was delighted with her interview with Harry, Hermione, and Luna the week after the first task. That they were an acknowledged trio, now, made things simpler. Colin loved the photograph credits he got. He was doing quite a good business selling his photos of the famous boy who lived. And students were asking for photos of their school Quidditch team favorites. Harry planned to drop the suggestion that he set up a photography studio when he graduated. He knew an investor who might be willing to help if the student was interested. Gary's class walked uncertainly into the large empty chamber in the West Wing dungeon. It had a high ceiling, easily 50 feet above their heads, with 2 platforms at the far end, one short and the other tall. The Muggle-born recognized them as diving platforms, but there didn't appear to be a pool. The ceiling showed a bright sunny sky, and extended down the walls to reveal the surrounding mountains, cutting off and returning to standard stone walls just above the highest diving platform. If you didn't know you were in a dungeon, you would think the room was an outside walled patio. The room itself was as warm as the nice summer day the ceiling showed. They couldn't even hear the current pre-winter storm raging outside the castle's walls. Harry looked back at Lockhart with a wary expression. He just knew there had to be a prank involved in this. He moved over to one side of the room while most of the others grouped in the middle. Harry held Hermione's hand as Susan, Hannah, Neville, Ron and Draco trailed behind them. A few of the more observant, and smarter, students slowly started moving towards Harry's group. Lockhart closed the door behind him and shouted happily, "Constant vigilance." The students all turned to watch as he swung his wand. The floor vanished, dunking the entire class into the huge pool, except for Harry and friends who were standing on the walkway by the wall. Lockhart watched carefully and used his magic to assist those who were poor swimmers to the edge of the pool. It wouldn't do to drown any of his students, much as some of them might deserve it. "Constant vigilance," he yelled, again, laughing manically. "You were all told this room contained a pool, yet none of you thought it might be right under you." He waved his wand a second time and dried the soaking wet, and very angry, students. Harry and company were laughing so hard he thought they would wet themselves. Only Draco managed a mediocrum of decorum by chuckling instead of whole-body laughs as the others did. "All right, Witch's changing room is on the right," he pointed to a door on the right wall beside the entrance wall. "Wizards is on the left," he indicated their door. "Swimming attire is in each locker and will automatically size to fit you. You each will select a locker by placing your hand on it. After today, your locker will appear in the changing room when you enter and disappear when you leave. Hurry up now, chop chop." 10 minutes later the wizards were staring at the swimsuit-clad witches, who were returning the favor. Both Sais were wearing turn-of-the-century one-piece suits. The only real difference between them was the girls' suits made allowances for chest size while the boys' suits were not as tight in the groin area. The universal color on the students' faces seemed to be blushing red, the exceptions being the Muggle-born and a few of the half-bloods. With any luck no one would drown because they were too distracted by the revealing costumes, although the Muggle-born and the more knowledgeable half-bloods were disgusted at the conservative cut of the suits, especially the boys' almost full-body suits with shoulder straps and leggings that extended halfway to their knees. Gary took control rather handily. "Today we're going to see how gillyweed works and meet a few dozen Grindylows in their native environment. Later we will learn the bubble head charm, which has many uses outside of underwater." Minutes later the entire class was once more in the pool. The pure-blood males found it a quite enlightening class, especially when they saw how clingy the wetsuits were on the witches when they climbed out of the pool at the end of class. The witches, it appeared, were just as interested in what they saw, but with far more blushing. It was, Lockhart decided, a very successful introduction to the new DADA course material. He knew the smarter students were already planning to use the bubble head charm in potions class to avoid noxious odors. The few students who didn't know how to swim he had quickly paired with others, with orders for them to practice in the pool as homework. Hermione and Luna seemed especially pleased at the prospect of teaching Harry what he needed to know, and showing him a certain amount of skin in the process. Gary was sure that soon a request for an indoor pool at Grimmauld Place would make its presence known. Headmistress McGonagall had started several new classes at the school Gary was pleased to notice. First, all incoming new students were given a test on their knowledge of both Muggle and Wizarding worlds. Based on those results they either took a 4-year class on Wizarding traditions and culture or they took a 4-year class on Muggle culture so they could pass as a Muggle without appearing as idiots in either dress or understanding technology. The first year was an overview, the other 3 went into details. Similarly, tough rules on magic use outside of classrooms were in place, with a 3 strikes rule implemented. First was points deduction, then detentions, then suspension. She tackled bullying head-on, with the same penalties. No one had privileges, due to their station. This was not popular among the pure bloods, especially those in Slytherin, who felt their rights, as naturally superior wizards and witches were being disregarded. They bitterly complained at the blatant discrimination forced onto them. She had expanded Quidditch game days to be parents' days as well, allowing parents to visit their children if they wanted. Muggle-born families had special arrangements so they could visit as well, and see their children using magic. She brought back Slughorn for the pre-owl students and allowed Snape to teach only the students looking for a Newt certificate. The rest of his time, he spent in research. He was almost pleasant, Gary was astonished to discover, with a wicked sarcastic wit. Slughorn also took over as head of Slytherin House. The dueling club was still ongoing, although separated into 4 groups so that students could always find a time that didn't conflict with their schedules. The results of Yaxley's more thorough interrogation back at the ministry were less than pleasing. Either Volduhor had obliviated him of the necessary memories, or a compatriot had done so. They had learned nothing of where the evil wizard was hiding, who was helping him, or what his plans were, except possibly to kidnap Harry Potter. Gary's alert charms around the old Riddle mansion were intact and untripped. A quick personal check revealed the building as empty as it had been when he had placed the charms over a year ago when he had visited the graveyard. He had renewed the charms, anyway, in the hope his enemy might make a mistake. He could only hope the plan for rebirth was going to be the same as it had been in his past. He didn't dare do more from fear that the evil wizard would detect it and ruin any possibility he had of stopping the resurrection. Or at least intercepting the results and dealing with the mad wizard before he fled to parts unknown. It had always puzzled Harry as to why Volduhor had been so insistent on having his resurrection on June 24th when the summer solstice was June 21st at 7:34 in the evening, which was 8:34 in Little Hangleton, an hour's time to the east. Was there perhaps a special boost to a revival ritual done 3 days after the solstice? Considering that the third Tri-Wizard task started at sundown, 10:34 in the evening, and there was a 3-hour difference there, too, perhaps there was a special reason to delay the ritual. 3 days later, 3 hours, 3 components to the ritual, perhaps that mattered. Whatever the reason, it seemed that Volduhor was intent on repeating the ritual he had performed in Harry's future. Which was actually a relief. Now Gary didn't have to worry that Volduhor had found another method to resurrect himself. Gary's only recourse was to proceed as if he knew nothing of the future past and concentrate on pranking. No, assisting, he was assisting Harry in his preparations. The rest of the school, though. The Christmas ball went as Gary expected, except this time Fleur asked him to be her date instead of Roger Davies as he remembered. Also different was Hermione and Luna attending as Harry's dates. Neville attended with Susan and Hannah, making him the envy of most males at the function. Gary was pleased to note, and taking attention from Harry. Harry was envied for his having 2 dates, sure, but his choices left much to be desired, according to the male population at Hogwarts. Hermione, while a beautiful date, had the reputation of a pushy know-it-all uninterested in the more feminine aspects of her personality, which put off most of the boys. They were looking for a girl a bit more deferential to their egos. And Luna was, well, Luna. Despite her ethereal beauty, her reputation as an oddball shook off almost all interest in her as a date. Ron came in with Draco and, to Gary's shock, did not spend his time at the buffet table stuffing his face. Gary had a wonderful time, and was entirely in his element, who knew dancing could be so much fun. He reserved most of his dances for Fleur, but whenever she had another partner, he found more than enough witches interested in dancing with him. Fleur seemed annoyed when she noticed that he so easily managed to find a dance partner when she accepted a request from another student. She was more used to watching her dates pine for her from the sidelines when she wasn't right with them. He was, she appeared to finally realize, a challenge to her as Avila. 33. If she wanted to keep his attention, then she would have to work at it. Her allure did nothing to help her. She had to rely entirely on her own intelligence, wit, and charm. A most unusual and challenging situation for her. And he was rather relieved not to hear, via his listening charms, Ron and Hermione having a rocking row over her being someone else's date. That pairing was well and truly out of question. He could finally safely ignore the prat. Although with his jealousy under control, and his eating habits approaching those normal for most people, Gary could almost see him as a casual friend to Harry, which Gary could now support. Harry had enough friends as support that Ron's jealousies, should they arise, would not be nearly as personally devastating as they had been in Gary's future past. Valentine's Day brought no changes to the romance scene, but did remind him of something that always had puzzled Gary in his first life: the number of students who had paired up while in Hogwarts and actually remained together as adults. At least until Voldemort had done them in. Sure, there was a lot of random dating and couples meeting and breaking up in that 7-year period, but when a couple declared themselves with an engagement, it always lasted. And he wasn't counting those marriages arranged by the parents. Those marriages usually had one or both spouses keeping significant others as secret lovers. That magical teenagers would marry their sweethearts in school and stay married flew in the face of Muggle experience. In the Muggle world, those marriages rarely lasted and the divorce rate easily matched the marriage rate in the population. On the other hand, divorce in the wizarding world was a rare occurrence, Celestina Warbeck's 2 divorces being the scandalous exception that proved the rule. Now that he had a chance to observe, though, he noticed something he had missed the first time around. When he carefully watched couples, he noticed their magic seemed to shift with time. Was it possible that when a wizard and witch, or other combinations, such as Ron and Draco, spent enough time in a voluntary love-based relationship that their magic began to adapt them to each other? To smooth over the rough edges that would normally form stumbling blocks to a long-term marriage. It didn't always work that way, as the adult Celestina proved, but mostly it did. Did the still-growing magic of the teens make possible a flexibility that the adults, more rigid and settled magic did not? Hermione and Harry seemed to fit together far better than he remembered them doing in his future. Certainly, without all the drama of that Harry future had faced in his second, third, and fourth years, it was easier for the wizard to form an attachment. That it blossomed so well in the here and now was gratifying. The previous year's Christmas and Valentine's Day, Hannah and Susan had been sitting with Harry, but now they were with Neville. Had magic dissuaded them, or was it that they were teenagers, and you simply could not predict what they were going to do next? Or had they decided that sharing Neville as ménage à trois made more sense than ménage à cinq with Harry? Watching how Hermione and Luna seemed to accept sharing Harry without jealousy, and Harry's happy equal acceptance of each girl seemed to support his conjecture that magic accommodated them. It had to be their magic working together that made a ménage à trios like that possible, because normally no Muggle-born witch would agree to such an arrangement. Her background of only seeing and hearing about exclusive couples would make that almost impossible to accept. 2 Muggle girls agreeing to share a boyfriend in the Muggle world was simply nothing that ever happened, or was extremely rare, especially when both clearly intended to marry their boyfriend at some point in the future. When he reviewed his memories of couples who had married, and not an arranged marriage, soon after leaving Hogwarts, such as all the Weasleys, the Tonks, the Diggorys, and others, they seemed quite happy. Apparently, marrying your high school sweetheart or sweethearts in the magical world was not only possible, but a good long-term strategy for happiness. That Harry would have a large family as a result was a foregone conclusion. With 2 wives, how could he not have a flock of kids? That would make Harry very, very happy, Gary knew. It made him somewhat envious, as well. Although, now that he considered it, Fleur did seem to seek out his company, usually under the guise of questions regarding magical defense and his personal experiences in combating dark wizards. He had the impression that if he didn't sit at the headmistress' table that Fleur would have come over to his table and sat beside him rather frequently. And she did seem to spend quite a bit of her time in the Great Hall during meals looking over at him, but then again, so did a number of the other witches, and a few wizards, in the Great Hall. She certainly was taking a more hands-on approach than other witches, frequently touching his arm while they talked or bumping her hip into him if they happened to be walking together as she asked questions about her classes. And while she wasn't the only Bobadans student to send him a valentine, she delivered hers in person and blatantly flirted with him. There was none of the embarrassed red face that the other witches all sported when talking with their hoped-for beau. Gary was truly happy that Harry was having the life Harry future past had never had. And he intended to live that life as vicariously as possible. Oh, how he was going to spoil those kids when they reached the toddler age. To make sure that he could do so, though, he was going to have to convince the boy that he was more than welcome to bring his family into Grimmauld Place. He knew Sirius wouldn't object to that situation. The second task was rather anticlimactic. Harry's hostage was Hermione, of course, Fleur's was Gabrielle, Victor had a Bobadan's girl, and Cedric's was Cho Chang, just as last time in the future past. Gary, as he had promised, stationed himself beside the hostages and made sure they were never in any danger whatsoever. He had also made sure, the night before, that the 4 champions understood that their hostages were in no danger whatsoever. Fleur, while upset at her sister being taken, wasn't anywhere near the state of near panic she had been in during Gary's future past life. Cedric and Fleur once again used the bubble head charm and swam down. As before, Fleur was waylaid by the Grindylows. Victor half transformed to a shark and ended up accidentally biting his hostage trying to undo the ropes holding her to the village merman statue. Harry, though, took the marauder route and chopped 2 pieces of wood off the dock with a cutting hex. He transformed them into small tubes he attached to his ankles with a sticking charm. Then he cast a banishing spell on the insides that turned the tubes into mini jets that shot him through the water at high speed. Like last time, he used gillyweed to adapt to underwater. He arrived at the hostages, freed Hermione, and shot back to the shore in well under half an hour. Unfortunately, though, he had to wait out the gillyweed's hour-long effect before getting out of the freezing water. That cost him a few points, but not nearly as many as Victor's biting his hostage. Still, he had the best time and won the second task handily. Oddly enough, though, when Crumb returned to his normal appearance he had waist-long bee-owned hair. However did that happen? Although, watching Harry flounder in the pool in the dead of night learning how to maneuver with those jet ski tubes and not end up with his knees against his chin spinning in circles underwater would be a treasured memory, and blackmail material, for the next 100 years, Gary decided. Because Rita didn't trash Hermione this time, there wasn't a repeat of Hermione's trip to the hospital wing from BP-trapped hate mail in March. It helped that the headmistress had changed the castle enchantments to divert owls with curses and howlers to another room where the house elves dealt with them. Aurors took the truly dangerous mail and tracked down the senders for an appropriate fine and punishment. Nevermore would Molly Weasley's dulcet tones reverberate around the castle as she berated her children for their various in-school transgressions. Thank Merlin. Fleur, it appeared, had told her parents more than a bit about her Hogwarts defense against the dark arts professor. And that she was interested in him, to Gary's stunned surprise. The first he realized it was when a short and quite plump wizard sought him out just after the judges announced their scores for the second task. The man was nattily dressed, with better-than-average looks, and wore high-heeled boots. He had a little, very pointed black beard. Smiling as he approached, the wizard bowed, saying, "Zonk you for the warning about our daughters, and for safeguarding Gem as you did. I am Monsieur Edgar Delacour." Smiling broadly, Gary replied, "And I am Monsieur Gilderoy Lockhart, honorary member of the Dark Force Defense League, 6-time winner of Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award, Hogwarts' beloved defense against the dark arts professor, slayer of basilisks and detector of dark wizards. Thank you for your kind words, but it is my job to safeguard all students at Hogwarts. I take the job very seriously. I do have a reputation to uphold, after all." The French wizard gave the appearance of being a kind and jovial person. "Oui, that is as my daughter has told us." He paused a moment then continued, "On behalf of my wife and daughter, would you use the honor of attending a small dinner party at our manor this Friday?" He held out a small ornate envelope. Caught off guard by the invitation, Gary took the envelope and carefully opened it. The details were there, including a brief note at the bottom stating the letter itself was a portkey time to bring him to their manor at the proper time. All he had to do was tap the envelope with his wand saying, "I accept," and the letter would notify, via an entry in the Delacour's invitation book at their home, that he intended to come. Then, on the proper date and at the right time, the portkey would activate. If he didn't accept, the letter remained inert. The French wizard bowed a second time. "Zonk you for your time, I must attend my wife and daughters now." His eyes flicked in the direction of the hospital tent where Madame Pomfrey was only now releasing her captives, patients. Crumb carried off the long-haired bee-owned look quite well, Gary noted, although his scowl seemed etched in stone at Madame Pomfrey's inability to restore his proper hair color. More than a few of the witches in the audience seemed to like his new look. Giving the French wizard a broad smile in return, Gary said, "Yes, of course, I understand." Faced with the choice of creating an international scandal by refusing an invite from such an important figure in the Wizarding France government, or having the chance to meet and impress such a powerful figure, Gary took out his wand and tapped the invitation. "And, I would be delighted to attend your dinner party." Gilderoy had only dreamed of making such an important contact, and Gary was quite pleased to see the invitation give a soft glow in response. And to note Monsieur Delacour's acknowledging nod. That Friday, the portkey delivered him to the patio behind the Delacour Manor. His ensemble was a light plum that he felt suited the occasion. Tucked into one of his expanded pockets was his complete autobiographical collection. These were the deluxe editions, with additional side notes and an extra chapter each. The last two books, Burrowing with a Basilisk and Restraining a Rat, also had both Harry Potter's and Hermione Granger's autographs. The latter had been astonished to be included in the signings. And thrilled. He had wanted to include Ginny Weasley's autograph, as well, but her part in the Basilisk affair was a secret that he could not allow out. There were two other families attending the party, apparently close friends of the adult Delacours. Gary played the Lockhart card fully. By the time he left, Fleur's parents, and their other guests, were giving her sidelong looks that clearly said, "Are you kidding me? You like this Pratt?" And Fleur was giving him a glare that threatened to melt the polar ice caps. Oh, to be a fly on the wall as Fleur attempted to tell her parents that Gary wasn't really the awful dandified twit he had appeared as that evening. Gabrielle, Fleur's younger sister, thought he was hilarious, and by the end of the evening was saying his signature, Order of Merlin, 3rd class, spiel in synchronization with him, to both their amusements. The second invitation had been a surprise, and he began to suspect that maybe Fleur was more serious about this than he had thought. And she was a very attractive young witch with, he had discovered, a delightful wicked wit. For that second visit, instead of a bottle of wine, he had brought a small vial of ground basilisk bone and a signed wizarding photograph of him standing in front of the dead basilisk. The parents had been much more approving when he left that evening. That he had spent much less conversation telling everyone how great he was and more on how wizarding society in Great Britain needed to change probably helped. Things progressed to the point where the invitations were almost weekly. Fleur's complaint about Gary's swimming pool prank, which he had pulled on every class, had caught Gabby's attention, and in answer to her questions he had described a few of his other pranks. Gabby, it appeared, loved pranks. And on his next dinner engagement, he had discovered that Gabby had clearly declared to her parents that if Fleur didn't want him, she would gladly take up the burden. Gary discovered he quite enjoyed his time spent with Fleur. He found himself looking forward to each invitation as an opportunity to be with her without being under the watchful eyes of the entire school. Plus, as his dating the young part which hadn't occurred in his future past, he didn't need to guard himself against inadvertently revealing something of the future possible. He did manage, though, to slip her a protection ring on her birthday. It was a simple copper ring that would react with a Protega-like shield if it detected harmful magic headed towards the wearer, just in case an Imperio-used champion might sneak into the maze. That he had replaced Bill Weasley as her probable partner did not disturb him in the slightest. If Bill had been her one and only destined mate, then nothing Gary could do would change that. If Bill was going to win the witch, then Gary and Fleur would break up over the summer. If she didn't, well, then, maybe she preferred him over Bill because of his sheer power as a wizard, that they were both immune to her Vila aura put them on equal footing in that respect. Last time, he had only been a little boy, and not suitable as partner, especially considering his teenage angst and tendency to hide from others. But now, well, he was a powerful adult and wasn't afraid to let others know it. Being humble was not part of Lockhart's personality, and Gary was certainly keeping to that reputation. Gary and Dobby had culled the Death Eater ranks to the point where Voldemort would find little to no response when he sent out his call at the end of his rebirth in the graveyard, should things go pear-shaped and that happen as it had in his future. He who must not be named, inner circle, minions were either dead or trapped in Azkaban. The other minions, those still alive, were in greatly reduced circumstances and couldn't just leave their jobs in response to his call without losing those jobs. And none of them were well off enough to just give up their livelihoods. Without his financiers, Voldemort would be hard-pressed to pay his people, or even to provide for himself, now that Lockhart owned and had emptied his vaults, and those of his followers. And losing Yaxley, and access to his vault, had been a big blow to the not-quite-dead wizard's plans. Those Death Eaters still alive had gone to ground quite thoroughly, doing nothing that might draw the attention of the De Vigilante, as they called him. Getting his attention, they knew, was a sure death sentence. And the Ministry's new policies of automatically arresting anyone with a Death Eater mark and interrogating him or her with Veritaserum didn't help them, either. 30 seconds under Veritaserum was a one-way ticket to Azkaban as a simple question: have you committed any illegal acts? Led to a litany of gruesome murders they had participated in during the First War, including half-bloods and those they called blood traitors. Not to mention battles they had fought with Aurors, which in itself was a crime with Azkaban time as punishment. And if an Auror died during one of those battles, well, that guaranteed a long stay in the wizarding prison. And even without that, there were the other crimes they had committed: bribery, fraud, and theft, to name just a few. And the rollback of the constricting laws passed by the previously dark-influenced Wizengamot had gone a long ways towards restoring equality for the non-pure bloods. The political climate was decidedly anti-dark, meaning no one could bribe their way out of a trial or sentence. The new required oaths promising that the Wizengamot members, and the bureaucrats, would be fair honest in their dealings in the ministry, as best as they could, had eliminated corruption. Anyone violating those oaths would find their magic forcing them to confess their misdeed to their supervisor and then the Aurors, and appropriate punishments issued. Wizengamot members would confess their misdeeds at the next scheduled meeting and, again, the appropriate punishments would be assigned. Sirius and Remus had taken the Gilderoy Lockhart investment fund and pushed it hard. There were now several dozen new businesses in the wizarding world. Diagon Alley and Hogsmeade were booming with customers. The Weasley twins' telly shop was a grand hit. They had managed to launch it just in time for Christmas. They had a staff of a dozen doing nothing but adapting the Muggle devices to the magical environment and selling them as fast as they could produce them. Their summer experiment to keep Belle happy had paid off in huge dividends. All they had to do was produce those owls and newts at Hogwarts to keep Sirius and Remus backing their store. Far too soon, the third and final Tri-Wizard task was upon them. There was a heavy Auror presence as the other two countries involved had contributed their share to the protective force. Having them patrol in threes would prevent any interference by a hidden Death Eater. And, when two patrols met, they traded a partner. That made it effectively impossible for Voldemort to somehow manage to get a Death Eater from each country onto the same triad for more than a quarter of an hour, or for one Death Eater to control the other two, far shorter than the time the champions were expected to be in the maze. At Gary's insistent suggestion, there was a reflection spell in place over the maze that allowed the spectators to easily see and follow the champions as they traversed the maze. The champions, however, would see nothing if they looked up. He suspected he would find himself torn between following Harry and following Fleur, his now unofficial girlfriend. She would become his fiancée after she graduated in a few weeks. He quite looked forward to that. Her fiery nature translated to rather torrid moments when the two were alone. Nothing more inappropriate than snogging, but wow, what snogging. Ah, Minister Bones, Gary said happily as he caught sight of the harried witch. Everything looks wonderful. You must have checked everything at least 3 times yourself, just as I would have done in your place. Unfortunately, my duties here at the school precluded me from providing any assistance, otherwise things would be flawless. He was posed perfectly in the waning sunlight as dusk approached so as to give the impression he had done all the work, beaming with pride as he looked out over the hedge maze. He pretended not to notice her rolling her eyes. By the way, has anyone checked the trophy cup for alterations to its portkey destination? It wouldn't do, would it, to have our winning champion stolen out from under our noses by such a simple tactic? Yes, Gil, the minister said a bit frostily, I personally checked the trophy this morning. It has one destination portkey spell on it, set to enable as soon as the first champion enters the maze. Wonderful, gushed Gary. And you never let it out of your sight until you placed it in the maze center yourself, right? He flashed a brilliant smile at her. And put an alarm spell on it so that should anyone come within 5 feet of it you would know. With a second alarm spell on the first that would go off if someone tries to dispel the first. Minister Bones stared at him. It wasn't difficult to pick up her frustration with him, mingled with a bit of chagrin that he was right. She hadn't put any alarm spells on the trophy cup. She had just verified the cup's existing spells. She smiled at him, A very non-humorous smile that said, "I'm doing this just to keep you happy and not because it really needs to be done and because I know you won't shut up about it until I do." "That's a splendid idea, a last-minute check." Sourly, she turned and waved at a nearby trio of oars. A moment later, the four of them trudged off towards the maze. Gary laughed to himself. He had already apparated to the cup and checked it over just a few minutes ago. It was clean, it would not portkey the winner away from Hogwarts. There were no signs of any tampering at all. There were also no signs of any activity at the graveyard, either. It was all very worrying. Perhaps he had been a little too thorough in eliminating Death Eaters. In any case, all he could do was soldier on and hope for the best. He turned and with a jaunty walk headed back to the Great Hall for a little last-minute pranking. Advice, he going to be giving the boy a bit of advice. "Remember, Harry," Gary said as they walked down to the Tri-Wizard Maze. "If anything goes wrong and you need to escape, the emergency portkey phrase is, 'There's no place like home,' and it'll bring you straight back to here. Oh, and don't forget to click your heels together 3 times while you say that. That's very important, don't you know?" He smiled down at Short Wizard, who was staring back at him with a skeptical expression. Gary wondered how long it would take the boy to notice that his shoes were now a gleaming ruby red. "And just to keep Sirius happy, I've placed about a dozen tracking spells on your person and clothes. If anything happens, I, Gilderoy Lockhart, Order of Merlin. 3rd class, honorary member of the Dark Force Defense League. 6-time winner of Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award, Hogwarts' beloved defense against the dark arts professor, slayer of basilisks, and detector of dark wizards, will be right there before you can say, Gilderoy Lockhart, Order of Merlin, 3rd class, honorary member of the Dark Force Defense League, 6-time winner of Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award, Hogwarts' beloved defense against the dark arts professor, slayer of basilisks, and detector of dark wizards. By the time I say that, it will be too late." Harry exclaimed. He sighed deeply. "Is all that really necessary, Gil? I mean, isn't all this overkill? After all, the second task went perfectly." Gary waffled a bit before saying quietly, "Harry, I'll let you in on a little secret." He paused and leaned closer. "This, and the next week, are Voldemort's last chance to get at you before you're at Grimmauld Place and beyond his reach for the summer. In his present form, he might not survive until fall. So, no, this is not overkill. In fact, no one knows this, but I plan to take you home tonight rather than risk you here at the school." Harry looked back at him solemnly and slowly nodded. "Now, give 'em hell, Harry," Gary finished as he gave the boy a slight push towards the judging stand, in front of which the other champions were waiting with Ludo Bagman. Gary tuned out what the windbag was saying as he carefully looked over the crowd in the stadium. He waved to Sirius and Remus, and the rest of the family. In the stands, Sirius looked to be laughing at Harry's new footwear. He turned back to the 4 champions just as Harry joined him. Harry was too nervous to notice the odd looks everyone was giving his flashy ruby red shoes. Bagman blew his whistle and off Harry trotted. Gary split his attention between the crowd watching the reflected maze and Harry. He was interested to see that unlike his time in the maze, Harry was having a bit of a rougher experience and running into far more creatures than he had. It seems that Crouch had made Harry Future Past's way through the maze easier. Well, good, at least this time the maze was a challenge to all of the champions, with no one receiving unfair advantages. Well, except for the fact that Harry was a 4th year while the other 3 were 7th years. In that case, was making Harry's way through the maze easier unfair or merely making up for the unfair advantage the other 3 had over him? Oh, well, it didn't matter. Gary didn't care if Harry reached the trophy cup, just that he emerged from the 3rd task unharmed. This time, without the Death Eater's interference, it was much more of a race than before. Harry, though, had a different thought process than the others and his solutions were sometimes a bit more straightforward. His response to the blast-ended Scroot was pure marauder. He disillusioned himself and casted a spell projecting the image of a second, smaller Scroot peering around the last turning several yards behind Harry. The real Scroot, seeing the smaller one, instantly moved to attack, charging around the corner in pursuit of the retreating image and forgetting entirely about Harry. Or, perhaps, wanting to eliminate the competition before getting to his snack. In either event, Harry rapidly ran to the next maze turn before the Skrook discovered his deception. Unlike the future past, though, all 4 champions reached the maze center at the same time. The 4 champions made rather quick work of the Acromantula, and then faced off against each other. There was no argument this time over who should grab the trophy first. It was a simple race that ended in a tie. As in Harry's future, nevertheless, the moment they touched the trophy, they were portkeyed away. This time, however, they appeared sprawling on the judge's platform and not in a dirty, decrepit, dangerous graveyard. After a brief moment's confusion, Bagman rallied and immediately started congratulating his 4 winners as they clambered to their feet. He approached Cedric first and pumped his hand up and down like he was trying to pump water from an old-fashioned iron water pump. He finally let go and turned to Victor, repeating his incessant hand-shaking and congratulations before turning to Fleur, and finally to Harry. He pulled Harry slightly away from the other champions, separating him from them as he congratulated the young wizard. That was when it happened. Ludo let go of Harry's hand and slapped him on the shoulder with his left hand. As soon as the older wizard lifted his hand, Harry disappeared. Gary stared, momentarily stunned, but then sprang into action. A quick wave of his wand and the various tracking charms on the boy began displaying their results. The 3 standard tracking charms reported nothing, indicating that the tags he had placed did not exist. Clearly, enchantments at Harry's destination prevented those tags from working. The 3 he had used in the middle of the future past war detected their tags, but merely indicated the boy was to the south and east, and between 300 and 1,000 miles away. It was the tracking spell taught to him by the Chinese wizard near the end of that future past war, however, delivered clear information. It revealed the boy had been portkeyed to a location that should be Little Hangleton, if he remembered correctly. That contradicted his alarm charms in Little Hangleton, which were silent and indicated that nothing out of the ordinary was happening in the tiny village, decayed mansion, or graveyard. Voldemort must have detected Lockhart's alarm spells and subverted them or prevented them from working. In retrospect, Gary should have expected that. Voldemort always had been extraordinarily cautious when he was weak. This time, because someone had attacked and killed so many of his minions, perhaps he had placed himself under a Fidelius charm. The attention brought by the public kidnapping, and the variety of tracking charms on the boy, negated most of the protections provided by the Fidelius. The charm can only hide you if you don't do anything monumentally stupid that reveals your presence, such as moving things not covered by the magic. People were only just beginning to react. An alert aura had hit Bagman with a stunner as soon as Harry had disappeared. The self-important promoter had probably been under an Imperius, and the head of the DMLE was hurrying over to investigate. Minister Bones was gone. Her security squad had portkeyed her to the ministry almost at the same time that Bagman had been stunned. They were taking no chances on an assassination attempt. The other foreign dignitaries were similarly being hustled away by their paranoid security forces. Gary quickly cast his Patronus, momentarily surprised when a magpie appeared instead of his peacock or stag. Find Minister Bones. Tell her that Harry has been portkeyed to Little Hangleton, a village about 200 miles north of London. I believe that's where Voldemort is, as well. I'm going there now and will send another Patronus as I find out more. Get a team of Aurors and Unspeakables ready. The bird rapidly flew off. He took a quick look around and saw both Remus and Sirius headed his way. He assumed that the Tonks and Belle were headed for the Hogwarts gates and home. Rather than face the 2 men and try to explain that he didn't want their help, there was no way he was going to risk their lives in this situation and possibly deprive Harry of their presence in his life. He took off Sam the Sorting Hat and cancelled the disillusionment charm on it. He tossed Sam as if it were a pointy frisbee to Sirius, getting an outraged, "Hey!" from the Sorting Hat as he did so. He gave the approaching wizards a broad smile and cheery wave as he spun on his heel and dissipated. He apparated into a small clearing not far from the Riddle family graveyard but well beyond any alarm enchantments that the Death Eaters might have emplaced. His 4 tracking charms confirmed that Harry was less than a mile away, and his direction. Lockhart disillusioned himself, silenced his breathing, footsteps, and anything else that might give him away by sound, scent, or visually, and then camouflaged his movements with a spell that restored wherever he stepped to its original condition. You would have to watch exactly where he stepped to see the momentary outline of his shoes. A final set of Notice Me Nots, both Muggle and magical, completed the set. He was as nearly invisible as it was possible to get without being a ghost. As he expected, Point Me merely made his wand spin uselessly. His specialized tracking spell still worked, though it hadn't yet been detected. He pulled out his broom, enlarged it, and took off as quickly as he dared move, which wasn't as fast as he could move. He didn't want to fly into a trap, after all. Once was enough for that. Barely 5 minutes after the abduction he found himself approaching the graveyard at a speed barely above walking. He felt the magical and Muggle Notice Me Not enchantments put up by a Death Eater, or the Dark Lord himself, as he passed through them at the edge of the graveyard. Voldy, it appeared, didn't want to be disturbed. If Gary hadn't been focused on following his tracking spell, it might have worked, too. But, had he cancelled the oath he and Bellatrix had sworn as he had meant to do? Had he covered everything needed? If things went completely pear-shaped, the poor girl might accidentally invoke one of the penalties while at Hogwarts or later in her life. It would be irresponsible of him to allow that situation to remain. He knew he had spoken with her. Ah, Belle, there you are. He had found her in the game room watching a Disney movie. Like most girls her apparent age, she was quite enamored of the Disney princesses. Could I have a few minutes of your time? Shrugging, she hit the pause button and followed him back to his study. He carefully closed the door behind them, and discreetly erected several privacy charms. It wouldn't do for anyone to hear what they discussed or did for the next several minutes. Bella, he said as he turned to her with a flourish, you'll be 8 years old in a few weeks and I thought I would give you some early birthday presents. Harry will grab the limelight when he wins the Tri-Wizard tournament, you know. Her eyes lit up and she bounced on her feet like an excited house elf. First, is this. He held out an open box with a 12 3/4 inch long wand, made of walnut with a dragon heartstring core. Her eyes opened wide. A wand, she barely breathed out. She looked at him, shocked. A real wand, she asked, hardly believing it to be true and hoping it wasn't a prank. Gary smiled broadly. A real wand, just as surely as I am Gilderoy Lockhart. He paused as if he were about to give his customary spiel, but her eyes were unwavering on the wand in his hand and she missed his pseudo-prank. He sighed. Here, take this. He held out the box and she slowly reached for it, still half expecting a prank. Not the box, silly, take the wand. She gingerly took the wand in her right hand and gave it a small wave. Multicolored sparks burst from the end. Excellent, Gary cried out excitedly. He hadn't been sure that the wand, made exactly as her old one, would still be appropriate for her after her de-aging in new life for the past 2 years, especially given how radically different her new upbringing was compared to her previous experiences in her father's mansion. That old buzzard hadn't had the slightest bit of humor in his soul, a true Scrooge from the sounds of him. Now hold your wand like this. He held his wand up and at a slight angle towards her. She imitated his stance and did so. Now touch the tip to mine and hold it there for a few moments. She did. I'll answer your questions when we finish, all right? She nodded. She would agree with almost anything to get her own wand. I, Lord Gilderoy Lockhart, Black Potter Peverell Gryffindor Slytherin Gaunt, declare now and for all time that Bellatrix Lestrange née Black, also known as Belladonna Bellatrix Black, has satisfied all conditions and requirements of the magical oath we both swore on May 16, 1992. I have provided her with the galleons promised, now residing in her personal vault at Gringotts, and she is free to come and go as she pleases. I have no farther expectations from her and will provide familial protections and assistance, as she needs. She has no farther expectations beyond those provided by any family for a member of the family. Therefore, I declare that magical oath complete, null, and void, without any enforcement or punishment powers whatsoever. So mote it be. Belle stared at him, jaw dropped open in surprise and shock. Say, I release Gilderoy Lockhart from said oath. She did. Now say, so mote it be. She did. Excellent, he exclaimed, lowering his wand to waist level. She stared at him. He could feel her curiosity and the questions boiling up in her mind. Before she could voice any of them, however, he said, "Obliviate." Her eyes turned blank and she swayed slightly. He gently relieved her of her wand and replaced it in its box. He stashed it in an expanded pocket and pulled out something else. This package was gaily wrapped in paper with balls of light flashing around on it. From its size and shape one could expect it to be a book. "And here's your first present," he declared, holding the package out to her. She blinked uncertainly, but then, with eyes shining in anticipation, the young girl quickly shredded the wrapping paper to reveal 1001 spells, charms, jinxes, and hexes every wizard and witch should know. "Wow," she breathed softly as she eagerly opened the book and glanced through it. While the Black Library had many books, most had protective enchantments to prevent underage children from accessing them. Which meant the only books she could read spoke only in general terms or were fiction or completely non-magical. After a moment, she looked up at him. "This is so cool." She clutched it to her chest and hugged it as if it were a pet. Smiling broadly, Gary held out a second package. She put the book on the study desk and just as quickly as before removed similar wrapping paper from the box and opened it. Momentarily puzzled, she held up a leather contraption with two belts. "It's a wand holster," Gary explained. "Dragon skin leather, with concealment, comfort, anti-summoning, and protection charms. Here, let me show you." He took the holster from her. "Hold your right arm out." She did, and he quickly fastened the holster in place. "While you are wearing it," he said, "no one can take it from you and only a very powerful cutting charm can harm it. To make it invisible, place your left hand fingers on it and say, 'Invisible.' Then say, 'Visible,' to see it again." She did that, too, making it disappear and reappear repeatedly. "When it's invisible, if someone grabs your arm, they won't feel it. It fits so well and is so comfortable that after a while you might even forget you're wearing it. Also, it has 3 compartments, one for a wand, one for a knife, and the third for whatever you want, such as a forever ink quill." Wow, she was truly speechless. He waited as she admired her present. Finally, she looked up at him and said, "This is wonderful." She sighed, "But I won't have a wand for 3 more years." She glanced wistfully at the book on the desk. Gary laughed as he held out a third package, a long box with square ends. Belle's eyes seemed to double in size and she stared at the box and then at Gary and then at the box. Almost not breathing, she tentatively reached out and took the box. This time she slowly removed the wrapping paper to reveal a simple cardboard box. Hands shaking, she opened it and stared at the revealed wand. It was short, barely 6 inches long, with a handle made of a different wood shaped to fit her small hand. She looked back up at him, disbelief plain. "A real wand." Gary laughed again, humor present in his tone as he said, "Yes, Belle, a real wand. Made of walnut wood with a dragon heartstring core." He paused a moment as she slowly took the wand out of the box. "It's a training wand, with special runes that prevent you from casting spells your magic can't handle. Every time you touch it, it measures your magical ability and won't let you do anything that might harm you." She waved the wand and a few bright sparks shot out the end. Children are allowed wands only after they turn 11 because before then their magic is unstable and unreliable. Using a wand before you're 11 can actually hurt you in the long term and stunt your magical growth by dangerously straining your magic at a young age. This wand, however, adjusts to your present abilities, and that will never happen. Unlike a regular wand, with this wand if you try to cast a spell your magic can't handle, nothing happens. A regular wand would attempt to do the spell and allow you to hurt yourself. Belle gave him a brief glance before waving the wand again to watch the sparks fly. She was listening. She just couldn't take her eyes off her new wand. "That book," Gary indicated the book on the desk by pointing with his chin, "has 1001 spells, but only about 10 of them are within your abilities right now. Lumos and Nox are 2 that you know. You've seen all the adults use those 2 so you know what they do." "Whisper Lumos." "Lumos," came the soft response. The tip of the wand glowed just as softly. "For the other 3 spells, you'll have to search the book to find them." She stared at the end of her wand, then whispered Nox. She threw herself at Gary, wrapping her arms around him and saying, thank you, "Thank you," in a steady stream. Gary patted her on the back. "Remember, the wand tracks your magical ability, so if you do a spell a bunch of times and drop your magical ability low enough, the wand will stop working. The same is true if you try to do a bunch of spells. Then you'll have to wait until your reserves replenish themselves completely before you can cast another spell. So when the wand stops working, you are done for the day. I'm the luckiest girl in the world to have you as my uncle. I love you," Belle said, her face still buried in his side. "Thank you, Belle," he replied softly. "You don't know how much that means to me." "Okay, then," he said, pushing her back a bit to look her in the face. "You can't tell anyone that you have a wand. And you have to promise you won't try to use someone else's wand, no matter how tempted you may be." Her face fell. She had been so looking forward to telling everyone about her new wand and wand holster. He smiled down at her. "Just imagine the pranks you can now pull if no one knows you have a wand. Padfoot will blame Mooney, Mooney will blame Tonks, and Tonks will blame Padfoot. And you'll be laughing yourself silly at all of them. They will never think that you cast the spell that changed their hair to Slytherin colors because that requires a wand, and they know you don't have a wand. Just remember, pranks are to make people laugh, not to hurt them or humiliate them." She stared back up at him for a moment, eyes shining in glee, then she smirked. "I know Uncle Gil." Then she smiled to herself, imagining all the mischief she could do without anyone suspecting her. "And if you do try to use another wizard or witch's wand, you will hurt yourself, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time. So promise, you have your own wand, don't use another's. If you do, and I'll know, don't you think otherwise, I'll be forced to confiscate your wand. And just think how awful it will be to know that you had a wand and lost it because you wanted to try someone else's wand." She nodded rapidly, clutching the wand to her chest. "I promise, Uncle Gil. I promise, I'll only ever use this wand. And you'll be the terror of Hogwarts when you arrive, 1001 spells already under your belt." He grinned, "But you'll have to read the entire book to find out which spells work today and which ones will have to wait until you're older. After you've mastered a dozen or two you'll begin to get a feel for which ones you can do and which ones are for later. And the wand and holster will be our little secret, won't they?" The ecstatic girl nodded energetically. "Okay, let me show you how the wand holster works." Of course, everything he had said about the wand was a lie. The de-aging potion he had given her had physically reduced her age, but hadn't changed her magical abilities except to slightly reduce her total capacity. Belle still had a very powerful magical core, far more powerful and stable than any child her apparent age. The runes concealed under the wand handle's top layer of wood were rather simple. They limited the power through the wand until she had used about 1% of her actual strength. And being a shorter version of the wand than was natural for her also would limit the power of the spells she could cast. The runes would slowly increase that power limit until she would be at full strength when she went to get her first wand from Ollivanders in 3 years. Until then, she would be more than happy to play with her wand instead of pirating one of the adults, as he knew she would have done otherwise. That would have been a disaster as everyone discovered she had an adult's capability at such a young age. And raised questions that Gary did not want anyone to even begin to think about asking. No, after careful thought, he had taken care of the oath and told Belle everything she needed to know. He looked up and realized that he was almost back to where he had started. That damned Volduhor, in addition to the notice-me-nots, had put up anti-magicals and anti-muggles charms. The anti-magicals enchantment had subtly made him redirect his flight while he was lost in thought. He cursed a bit, then turned around and headed towards the graveyard, again. This time he wouldn't allow himself to be distracted. He had taken care of everything he needed to do before the third task had started. He didn't need to return to Hogwarts and fix the incoming new students book of names to reflect that Belladonna hadn't already graduated. Being head of Gryffindor and Slytherin houses had granted him easy access to that book, and it took only a few minutes to affix the necessary charm. Bella would get her letter right on her 11th birthday, just as she was supposed to. And her name would appear as Belladonna Bellatrix Black, just as it was supposed to. Lestrange would not appear. He had even fixed the castle enchantments so that the headmistress or headmaster would only see her corrected name if they should directly examine the castle's protective enchantments. Even Harry's Marauders map would show her name as Belladonna Black. Sam, the Sorting Hat. He hadn't forgotten to tell the Sorting Hat what needed to be done, had he? Ah, Mr. Lockhart, Sam said almost as soon as Gary dropped the hat on his head. I've missed your company. The headmistress's office is so dull. What new adventure are we about to embark upon? The hat shifted slightly, then settled. Ah, said Gary, sorry, Sam, no adventures this time. I just wanted to warn you that Bellatrix Black is going to be coming in 3 years to be sorted again. Gary could feel Sam's curiosity. Yes, well, you see, I kidnapped her from Azkaban, then de-aged her after removing all her memories from age 6 on up. It was either that or kill her, and I didn't want to do that. She is a Black, after all. And with Sirius, Remus, and Nymphadora living with her at 12 Grimmauld Place, I'm sure we can prevent her from following the path she did the last time. She certainly has no problems with half-bloods and muggleborns the way she used to. In fact, she seems to regard most purebloods as complete twits, suitable only for pranking. He sighed. Which means, I'm sure, that she'll fall ass over teakettle for a pureblood before she graduates. Well, anyway, I wanted to warn you that I, as Lord Gryffindor and Lord Slytherin, command you to not reveal anything to her or anyone else about her previous life as Bellatrix. I don't care what house you sort her to, although I would prefer it not be Slytherin, if you can help it. I want her to have a fun time here and not become the insane dark arts obsessed bitch she used to be. I will do as you command, Lord Gryffindor Slytherin. I will not reveal her past to anyone, especially not to the girl herself. Thank you, Sam. Sam shifted and seemed to lean over slightly, as if leaning closer, an odd sensation considering Gary was wearing Sam on his head. Mr. Lockhart, Mr. Potter, you seem to have integrated your personalities rather well. There is no dividing line between the two of you the way there used to be. Might I take a closer look? Gary shrugged. Maybe Sam would be able to determine exactly what had happened. Oh, no, oh, I see, oh dear, Sam shifted around Gary's head, as if he were walking around him. Most interesting. There was a long pause, then, thank you. Well, demanded Gary, what did you find? For a moment, he thought Sam wasn't going to respond. Well, Sam finally said, that spell that hit you was apparently a prelude to a possession attempt, but you escaped before the possession could take place. The spell seemed to have had 2 components. The first was to crush down the personality in the brain of the one being possessed, in this case, Mr. Potter, because he was the one in control at that point. Your escape, while fortuitous, would have left a normal wizard comatose for many months with his personality knocked out. In your case, with your 2 personalities already in place, it simply put Mr. Lockhart in control while you slumbered. The second component, the active part, was to merge all the memories of the subverted personality with the controlling personality, making them one and destroying the subverted personality in the process. In your case, Mr. Potter was the dominant personality even though Mr. Potter was asleep. It appears that after all the memories were combined, the spell tried to establish Mr. Lockhart as the dominate personality, and failed. And in that failure, it simply merged the 2 personalities into a new one. So, Mr. Lockhart, you are now one new person with the traits and strengths of both, as well as the defects and weaknesses. Fortunately, most of the strengths and traits of one compensate for the weaknesses and defects of the other. You are a rather well-rounded personality as a result, who enjoys pranks far too much. The hat shifted again. I must say, I approve. Gary sat there in shock. Voldemort had developed a spell to aid him in his possession of others. Probably that was what had made it so easy for Quirrell to accept and adjust to his possession. Only Harry's typical fantastic last-minute luck in escaping had really saved them. Well, he finally said. That's interesting. Still in a bit of a daze, he said, thank you for your help. Sam tilted, his version of nodding assent. Gary slowly walked out of the headmistress' office. Gary spent several days contemplating what he had learned and his narrow escape. Gary looked around and realized he had once again started to leave the graveyard. Damn it. This was annoying as hell. He sighed and then used a sticking charm to make sure he remained on his broom. Then he cast another spell that locked the broom onto a course to follow his tracking spell, regardless of any attempt he might make to change course. It would remain in effect until he was close enough to hear or see what was really happening in the graveyard, at which point the anti-magical enchantment would fail to affect him and he could safely take control again. For the third time he set out for the graveyard and Harry Potter. Gingrotz. Ragnarok. Had he done everything needed? Besides updating his will, had he forgotten anything? So, here's my new will and last testament, Ragnarok, Lockhart said, handing over the parchment. The wizard settled back in his chair as he waited for the goblin to read the new legal papers. Ragnarok had still sneered at him as he entered the plush office reserved for the goblin in charge of Lockhart's accounts, which also included the accounts of Black, Potter, Peverell, Gryffindor, Slytherin, and Gaunt, although the sneer wasn't nearly as impressive as it used to be. In fact, for a goblin, it might even be termed welcoming. Now the largest single depositor at Gringotts, the lower-ranked goblins treated Lockhart almost like royalty. Watching them rush around and kowtow to him was most gratifyingly. Even more amusing was watching the reactions of the other wizards and witches in the main lobby at those very uncharacteristic actions. It was quite satisfying on several levels. The goblin looked up at him. "You are relinquishing head of House of Potter, Gryffindor, and Peverell to the Potter heir when he reaches majority or immediately if you become incapacitated or die," he stated. "Yes," affirmed Gary, "they are rightfully his." The goblin grunted. "House Black is to go to Miss Belladonna Bellatrix Black under the same conditions." "Yes," affirmed Gary, again. "Sirius has declared he has no interest in assuming that seat, and he doubts he can father any children, anyway, considering his time in Azkaban. I did bequeath him rather large amounts of galleons so he will not lack for funds, in any event." Ragnarok did sneer at him. "I can read. So stop wasting my time telling me something I already know," was the subtext. However, he continued, his expression clearly indicating he thought Gary was an idiot. "House Black can only be inherited by a wizard, thus she is ineligible." Lockhart grinned, and handed him a second parchment to read. "Sirius Black agrees to act as temporary head of House Black, until she has a son, at which point she will become regent. The inheritance laws do not restrict regency to wizards, although that is the custom. Should she die before that happens, then head of house devolves to Nymphadora Tonk's son, as those parchments indicate." The accounts manager studied both parchments for a few minutes, then referred to an ancient inheritance laws book. Then pulled out an even older book for farther study. Finally, he set the books aside and studied the parchments again. Reluctantly, he nodded. A sly look crossed his face. "It will be quite expensive preparing all the correct paperwork for this." "Naturally," the wizard said, his own expression bland. "Just so long as it cannot be successfully challenged and overthrown." The goblin grunted assent, but his smirk was easily visible. He looked back at the will, then said, "Houses Lockhart and Gaunt are to go to your sister's sons or daughters, should any of them become a wizard or witch, or throwing the accounts into dormancy should they not. Being lesser houses, there are no restrictions preventing witches from being the head of house. These will be filed today and the appropriate supporting documentation provided," Ragnarok concluded. "Excellent. And before we go farther, Ragnarok," Gary said, leaning forward to hand another parchment to the goblin. The goblin read the short note, then looked up at the wizard, fury evident in his expression. Unperturbed, Lockhart nodded. "That's correct. If Gringotts or any goblin, wizard, witch, or agent in their employ should reveal or acknowledge that Belladonna is actually Bellatrix Lestrange née Black, who has been de-aged and obliviated of all memories back to the age of 6, I will close all my accounts and transfer their contents to the banking gnomes in Switzerland. That includes not denying the fact by saying things such as, 'We cannot confirm or deny,' or, 'That is private information,' or any other method that might imply that she is Bellatrix without actually saying so or denying that she is. I expect Gringotts and its employees and agents to simply say, 'Her name is Belladonna Bellatrix Black, not Bellatrix Black or Bellatrix Lestrange née Black. She is not the adult woman that was a follower of the self-styled Lord Voldemort, also known as Tom Riddle.' Or words to the same effect." Gary leaned forward before the goblin could object. And, should the houses already have passed to my successors and word leaks out about her identity, I have already filed the proper paperwork, signed by my sisters, Harry Potter, and Sirius Black, with my lawyers to close and transfer their accounts to the gnomes. That should protect her secret quite well. He left Gringotts in a quite cheerful mood, leaving behind several very unhappy goblins. And should things really go badly, he had left a series of parchments with his lawyers for the Mistress Bones explaining how he had destroyed all the Horcruxes and that Voldemort was as mortal as any other man. He heard a voice ahead, "Be blood of the enemy, forcibly taken, you will resurrect your foe." Damn, he was too late to stop the ritual completely. Still floating on his broom, he followed the tracking spell and soon approached the site of Voldemort's rebirth. A Death Eater he didn't know was standing by the massive cauldron, which was boiling and bubbling. The moon was past half full and contributed only a bit of light to the scene. Fortunately, the Death Eater had provided a few torches around the graveyard so he wouldn't be stumbling around in the dark trying to do a finicky ritual. Harry, as he had been in the future past, was bound tightly to a statue. The ropes were quite secure, but a silent cutting spell made quick work of them. "Harry," the older wizard whispered, "duck behind this gravestone and then run straight away until your emergency portkey works, about 100 feet after you leave this cemetery. Don't take chances. Leave me to deal with these buffoons." Before he could deal with Tommy Boy he needed to eliminate Nagini. The snake had to be somewhere around here. Unfortunately, the enchantments on the graveyard and its environs rendered his Point Me spell useless at finding the snake. Only his special spells on Harry had allowed Lockhart to find him. "Robe me," he heard an annoyingly high-pitched voice say, almost like a little girl playing with helium. Gary glanced around the statue. Merlin, but that was one ugly monstrosity standing in the cauldron. He wondered when the wizard would realize things had not gone as well as he had intended. Standing in the cauldron was a creature. It looked to be vaguely squirrel-shaped, but interspaced with patches of fur, were bare skin, and occasionally shiny scales. Considering the size of the cauldron, Gary should have been able to see the wizard's legs, but instead all he could see was belly. Tom Riddle's new body was clearly more adapted to running on all fours than walking on two. The pointy face reminded Gary strongly of the rather rat-ish appearance of Peter Pettigrew after a long decade stuck in his animagus form, but much, much more exaggerated. Tommy Boy, though, did not have that animagus excuse. His mouth stuck out somewhat like a rodent, as did his nose, the two looking much like a short snout. His ears were above his head, fully furred and tufted, while his eyes were shifted to the sides, giving him a much wider range of view than a normal human. His hands were more claw-like paws. No pure blood would follow such an obvious twisted breed, no matter how powerful he might be. If nothing else, Gary had severely inconvenienced the Dark Lord. Voldemort would have to die and try again to resurrect himself, if only so he wouldn't have to spend the rest of his immortal life as a squirrel-snake-man hybrid. When his command went unanswered, the Dark Lord looked at his servant's horrified face and realized things were not as rosy as they were supposed to be. He looked down at himself and screamed in anger. "What have you done to me?" He leapt out of the cauldron with a squirrel's quickness. "Oh, that wasn't good," and tackled his follower, yanking the wand from his hand. "Crucio!" he screamed, his voice edging higher into the nearly unhorrible zone. It was at that point that Gary heard a noise behind him. He turned. At the edge of the cemetery, he saw movement. It was Harry running behind another headstone. A huge snake followed him. Oh, of course. The one direction Harry would choose to run was the one guaranteed to meet Nagini. The snake was doing an admirable job of herding Harry back to the graveyard. Gary, still on his broom, shot off towards the two while unleashing a strong cutting curse at the snake. Apparently, being a Horcrux had improved the snake's reflexes, if it was a Horcrux at this point. It was hard to tell with the evil taint that surrounded the graveyard. The snake whipped to the side. The curse sailed past it. Gary reached Harry and slid off the broom. "Here," he said. He thrust it at the little wizard. "Take this and get the hell out of Dodge. I'll handle the snake." Harry grabbed the broom. He hopped on and shot straight up. Gary dodged to his left. The infuriated snake, probably taking its cues from its still incoherently screaming master, slammed to the ground where they had been standing. Its fangs dripped poison as it hissed at him. It was as incoherent as its master. A deadly game of tag followed. It tried to tag him with its poison. He tried to tag it with a cutting curse. Neither made any real progress. The screaming by the cauldron stopped. Gary realized Volduhor was aware of his snake's game. Squirrelmort screamed above him. Gary threw himself behind a statue as curses rained down. The damn bastard had climbed one of the statues. The snake lunged towards him, mouth open wide to bury its fangs in the trapped wizard. Gary saw his chance. He threw the strongest cutting curse he knew straight into its wide-open mouth. Like the basilisk before it, the inside of its mouth had little in the way of magical protections. The curse sliced through the back of the snake's mouth, severing its spine and major arteries. It flopped to the ground, sliding into Gary and knocking him over. And, incidentally, out of the way of Squirrelmort's curse, which blew apart the dead snake's eye instead. Voldemort fell off the statue on which he was standing, screaming. Ah, so the snake was a Horcrux. Just as had happened in the Harry's future, destroying a Horcrux vessel at such close range had a devastating effect on the Dark Wizard. Gary lay stunned on the ground for a moment, dazed. He had hit his head on the side of a gravestone. Slowly he got back to his feet. He knew he didn't have much time. He walked over to motionless would-be King of England. He started to stupefy when a bludgeoning curse hit him from the side, throwing him across the body on the ground into another gravestone. His armored vest protected him from serious injury, but his side hurt like a bitch. The Death Eater had apparently recovered from his master's curses and had entered the fray. Gary cursed himself for forgetting the other wizard. He rolled quickly to the side, scrambling to his feet. Another curse banged into the gravestone where he had just been lying. He dodged behind another gravestone and started firing off curses as fast as he could. In a matter of moments, he had the other wizard doing the dodging and shielding. He had just hit the other wizard with a stupefy when a powerful Bombardo curse exploded the gravestone he was using for a shield. Squirrelmort had awakened. Gary started shielding as he searched for his opponent. The next curse exploded his shield with a bang and threw him down. That was when he saw Squirrelmort. Damn, but he was quick. The creature darted closer. He sneered, in a girlishly high squeaky voice, You thought you could best Lord Voldemort. He screamed, Avada Kedavra. Gary grabbed a chunk of the shattered gravestone and threw it in a desperate attempt to block the curse. To both their surprise, it worked and exploded into dust. Gary scrambled back and threw a Langlock at the other. Volduhor sneered, stepped to the side quickly and launched another Avada Kedavra. There was nothing at hand and Gary realized he didn't have the time to dodge. That was when the worst possible thing that could happen, happened. A blur shot in front of Gary from his right and above. It caught them both by surprise. Voldemort again fell screaming to the ground. Gary watched as Harry Potter fell off his broom and tumbled wildly across graveyard. Harry had taken the curse for Gary. He had sacrificed himself without regard for his own life. For a moment, Gary stood too stunned to move. Then he spun back to Volduhor and cast the most powerful stupefy he could manage. Then he did it again. And again. If something is worth doing once, it's worth doing twice. Or 3 times. Maybe even 5. And what he should have done the first time Squirrelmort was temporarily out. This time, at the very least, Voldy would have the mother of all headaches when he awoke. Gary reached into his expanded pocket and took out 2 halves of a glass sphere, each with numerous Parseltongue runes etched into it. Those had taken quite a bit of research to create. He had finally discovered that all he had to do was be thinking in Parseltongue when he cared the runes to make them unreadable by anyone not gifted with that skill. He shrank Squirrelmort down until he would just fit inside one of the half-spheres, then levitated the creature into it. One half of the sphere had grooves that ran a short distance cut into the edges. The other half had matching tabs that were not quite as long. He lined up the 2 and pressed them together, then turned the top half until it stopped. A set of magic charging runes were divided between the 2 halves. Turning the 2 hemispherical sections to their stops lined the runes up perfectly, top to bottom. He pushed magic into it until the next set of runes reacted and sealed the 2 sections into one seamless piece. After a moment, The next set of runes engaged and made the sphere unbreakable. The next set of runes made it impermeable to magic. Then there was a set that made it indestructible by melting or other actions. The final set prevented wraiths or any other spirit from escaping the prison. Gary checked on his other opponent, who was still out cold. He hit him with Petrification Curse, then another Stupefy. He would let the Ministry deal with the Dark Idiot. He again reached into his pocket and took out a second pair of half-spheres. These had the runes carved on the inside. He dropped the first sphere into one half-sphere of the new one, then put the other half-sphere over it. The two halves barely fit over the first sphere, but the charging runes lined up perfectly and powered the same sequence of runes that had decorated the first sphere. Now, no one could abrade the runes off and free the creature inside. Volduhor was constrained, with no escape. He dropped the sphere into his pocket and hurried over to where Harry was lying. A quick diagnostic spell showed no broken bones. It also showed no life. Gary remembered his experience when he had died to get rid of Volduhor's last soul shard. Meeting his parents before dying had been great. If he hadn't needed to finish off the evil bastard, he probably wouldn't have returned. This time, though, Harry had two very appreciative girlfriends, not to mention his new family in Bella, the Tonks, and his godfather. This time, the school had rallied behind him time and time again. He hadn't been vilified in the press. Rita had gone a long ways towards making sure he was accepted by the wizarding world. In other words, Harry should have everything to live for and no regrets at leaving his parents until sometime far in the future. Smiling to himself, Gary cast his Patronus, shaking his head slightly as the magpie appeared again. When had that happened? Madam Minister Bones, I am at the Little Hangleton Cemetery, beside the old Gaunt House Manor. I have captured and secured Tom Riddle, whom you know as Lord Voldemort. You might want to send a team here to survey the area and make sure there are no other Death Eaters in hiding. He watched the Patronus bird fly out of sight far more rapidly than any live bird could manage. Still, it would take a few minutes for the Aurors to arrive, at least 15 considering the distance the silvery bird had to cover. In the meantime, he carefully levitated Harry into a more comfortable position and cleaned him up. He healed the many scratches and cuts on the boy wizard, including the knife wound inflicted by Volduhor's minion. Now, all he could do was wait for Harry to return. Gary conjured up a recliner. He wondered if Harry was meeting with Dumbledore. He made an expression of disgust at that thought, or if he was meeting his parents. Gary sincerely hoped the boy was finally meeting his parents. He settled down to wait, with only the noise of crickets and other insects in the otherwise deathly quiet graveyard. Gary lay upon his deathbed looking at his family gathered in the large ballroom. His bed was tilted so that he could easily see across the room. What with grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, hey, at 180 years old he had almost 8 generations gathered in the room, not to mention the nephews and nieces contributed by his sisters. There were far too many wizards and witches to fit into his bedroom, even as enormous as it was. And that didn't include his many friends and business associates, especially Harry Potter and his 4 wives, Hermione, Luna, Daphne, and Gabrielle. Sirius had passed on long ago, but the Black family was also in good attendance. Now a Grey family, as were Harry's and Gary's, they had been instrumental in dragging the wizarding world into accepting the non-magical as worthy of their respect. The party was in full swing. Gary had insisted upon it being a party, with 2 bands alternating sets between current hits and oldies for the more mature set. Watching both his descendants and Harry's mixing and enjoying themselves set his heart to glowing with happiness. Harry's 5th year had been just like his 3rd, quiet except for the normal drama teenagers get up to in a boarding school. Daphne Greengrass had started hanging out with Hermione and Luna in 3rd year as the peer pressure of the Death Eaters' children faded with their fortunes. The Tri-Wizard tournament hadn't changed that, except to give him more support. She and Hermione had always battled for first place in their classes and a friendly rivalry had emerged and then blossomed into an odd friendship. Early in 5th year she had apparently confessed to Hermione about liking Harry. By Christmas the trio became a quad. Fleur and Gary's wedding in the spring of 1996 had brought the little Vila back into contact with Harry and his 3 girlfriends. She had stayed at Grimmauld Place with the Tonks, Bella, Sirius, Remus, Harry, her sister and Gary for the summer. Gabrielle had transferred to Hogwarts during Harry's 6th year and by Christmas had joined Harry's harem, as the other students had started calling them. Harry's 3 lordships. It turned out there was a magical tome in the ministry that listed heirships, and Lockhart's filing of a will with the goblins had triggered it, had inundated him with marriage offers. Fortunately, the bribes paid to the goblins had managed to delay that revelation until after Harry had finished his owls. Accepting Daphne and Gabrielle as official girlfriends in 6th year along with the already established Hermione and Luna had brought him peace and quiet as he was then, officially, off the available list. The summer before 7th year had solidified the arrangement into official betrothals. Waiting for Gabrielle to graduate had delayed things only a bit in the scheme of life, and gave Harry a chance to establish himself as a seeker in professional Quidditch for several years. The quad wedding of Harry and his wives, the summer after Gabrielle passed her owls, was the social event of the year. All 4 wives giving birth to their first children, 2 girls and 2 boys, just 10 months later was another major event for the wizarding world. Despite having 4 wives, and having babies at a rate that rivaled that of the Weasleys, or maybe because of it, Harry stayed in the Quidditch League for almost 30 years. Several people joked that he was growing his own Quidditch League, given how many of his offspring ended up being talented players. Next, he joined the Aurors, but that lasted only a few years. It was far too grim an undertaking and he would rather enjoy life. Enforcing the law at the end of a wand was just not his cup of tea. If attacked, he defended himself and his charges with an intensity and dedication that astounded others, but that his family took as normal for Harry. He had finally settled down in the ministry, exercising his power with his 3 lordships to help the average wizard thrive in the magic world. Every time Gary saw Harry smiling, it made him happy. Fleur, and then later the rest of his family, at first had been puzzled at how closely he had followed Harry's family and career, and his obvious delight at Harry's good fortunes. When Harry hit a rough spot in life, Gilderoy Lockhart Slytherin always seemed to be nearby with helpful advice and assistance. And pranks. But they had accepted his rationalization that he had emotionally adopted the boy during his time at Hogwarts. Lockhart had found himself terminally bored staying at home, so he and Fleur went exploring around the world. His talents with the dark arts had segued him into a career as a premier curse breaker, which led to a never-ending supply of book releases chronicling his accomplishments. He had ended his illustrious career with 40 years as Hogwarts' most beloved headmaster. When Fleur had died of old age, Gary had found his life remarkably empty. His descendants had tried to help, but the light of his life was gone and it showed. Only seeing Harry and his wives could bring him out of his doldrums. And now it was his turn to go to the next great adventure. He found himself quite looking forward to it. The children's band had just concluded their set. It was still early for most of the crowd and not yet midnight. But it was time. He was tiring and couldn't stay awake much longer. He reached out and touched a rune that cast a sonorous on himself. A soft, but penetrating, gong echoed through the room. The crowd quieted and turned towards the stage. "Thank you all for coming tonight. I know you all have more important things to do than listen to an old man's ramblings, but I did want to say a few things. First, people have been asking me, and Harry, what happened to that dark wizard Voldemort? Everyone knows he kidnapped Harry Potter, and that a battle took place, but we've never said what happened. Did Voldy run away again? Did Harry Potter once again vanquish the evil monster? Or had Harry finally destroyed the Git?" He had the crowd's complete attention. I chose not to say so that the next Dark Lord, or Lady, would think twice about making a power grab. Most knew of Voldemort's temper and none wanted to test it. That worked for several decades. Long enough for us to put societal safeguards in place that have prevented any new truly evil wizards or witches from appearing. With vigilance, that will continue for a long time. He paused and took a small sip from the glass beside his table. It was a mild pepper-up potion. Too strong a one would give him a surge of strength that wouldn't last more than minutes and would doom him when it wore off. As it was, the healers said he only had a few days left, if that. And he didn't want to rush it, even if death was an old friend. The dark wizard known as Lord Voldemort was indeed vanquished by Harry Potter, but it was about a week after the kidnapping. It went like this. "Why are we so far down in the ministry, Gil?" Harry asked as he followed the older wizard. The unspeakable accompanying them was levitating a glowing spherical crystal just in front of them, which unsettled him. Whether it was the crystal, which kept drawing his eyes for some reason, or the unspeakable himself, Harry wasn't sure. "Well, Harry, that's a deep subject," was Gary's casual reply. Harry groaned and said, "That's terrible, Gil." The spinning doors had surprised Harry and made him unsteady on his feet, assisted by a small spell Gary had casted on him before they entered the ministry. Harry had then distracted the unspeakable by grabbing his cloak and neither noticed the subtle spell Gary cast on the sphere being transported. They entered a small auditorium that was empty except for chairs centered on a platform that held an archway. The arch drew his attention immediately as the gray curtain across it seemed to sway and move in a breeze he couldn't feel. "This, Harry," Lockhart said quietly, "is called the Veil of Death. The unspeakables believe it is a doorway to the realm of the dead. If you listen, you can hear voices coming from it, but you can never determine what they are saying. It draws you like a moth to a flame. If you aren't careful, you could find yourself inadvertently stepping through it." "Sit," he said, pointing at a chair and sitting down in another. The unspeakable remained standing. Harry sat, looking at Lockhart questioningly. "Harry, as you know, Voldemort didn't die in 1981 when he tried to kill you with an unforgivable curse. The reason is simple. He created these things called Horcruxes, soul anchors. They're also called soul vessels. He did a terrible and very evil ritual in which he split a piece off his soul and stored it in something else, such as that diary that Ginny Weasley had in your second year." Harry gasped, his eyes wide. "Ginny released the basilisk." Gary nodded. "Under the control of part of Tom Riddle's soul, she had no choice. If I hadn't taken the diary from her, the diary would have taken her very life force and killed her while creating a new body for the soul fragment in the diary." Harry leaned back, stunned. "And he didn't just do it once. Or twice." Harry reflected for a moment, then said softly, "Oh my God. My scar." "Indeed, Harry, indeed. That was why I focused on recovering the Founder's items in your second year. As well as the diary, Tom Riddle had invested a piece of his soul in Hufflepuff's cup, Ravenclaw's diadem, and Slytherin's locket. He had a sick fixation on the Founder's items. Gryffindor's sword was the only item he did not befoul, and that was because he couldn't find it. There were 3 other items he did this to, as well. Well, 2 I knew for sure at that end of second year, the 3rd I wasn't sure of until we were in the graveyard after you were portkeyed away. One was the gaunt head of House Ring, which I destroyed. The 3rd was that giant snake, Nagini, that was chasing you in the graveyard. The second one was an accident. He had prepared the ritual in advance and only needed the final component to complete it. But he died before he could do that." Harry nodded, waiting for his friend to continue. Lockhart seemed lost in thought. "And I was the second, wasn't I?" he finally prompted. The older wizard took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "I wasn't going to tell you, at first, before we ended up at the graveyard. I had hoped that I could head Tom off and trap him. If I could trap him, then he would be harmless. He would be isolated from the world under a heavy draft of living death potion as well as a stasis charm, and never again would you have dreams or nightmares from him. I planned to keep a careful eye on you while I searched for a way to remove that final fragment without harming you. Unfortunately, he managed to get to you before I got to him. And, well, you know the rest." Harry sat silent for the longest time. Then he looked up at Gilderoy. "So why are we here? You killed Voldemort, right? And I don't have that soul fragment anymore, it's gone." Gary looked away, at the arch, for several moments, then turned his attention back to Harry. "There was a prophecy concerning you, Harry. Your favorite divination teacher at Hogwarts had spoken it back in 1970. Trelawney," Harry said in a disgusted tone. "Indeed. It was why Dumbledore hired her, to keep her out of Voldemort's clutches, because who knew what he might do with the seer if he found she had a real talent. I won't bore you with the prophecy itself, it was a rather typical piece of drivel. Unfortunately, A Death Eater overheard part of the prophecy and carried the tale to Lord Voldemort. The superstitious twit believed it and set about making it a self-fulfilling prophecy. If he had ignored it, well, he would be ruling the world now. The full prophecy said that someone born at the end of July would have the power to vanquish the Dark Lord. 2 boys fit that description, you and Neville. Neville, repeated Harry, stunned. Yes, and that's why he killed your parents. He planned to go after Neville next. Harry stared back at him, too surprised at the revelation to say anything. Both sets of parents had gone into hiding, as you know, to protect you 2 infants. And were betrayed. That part of the story you know. And that was why he was so obsessed with you. It was you who sent him off. It was a major blow to his pride, and he had to set that right. What you don't know is that your scar was a sign that Voldemort had marked you as the one who had the power to defeat him. I learned of this situation and decided to take a hand, but I didn't know about the Horcruxes at first. It was ludicrous to believe that a child not yet in his teens could battle the second most powerful wizard in the world and win. So, I stepped in to see what I could do. As soon as I saw you at the Flourish and Blots, I knew things were in dire straits. When I arrived at Hogwarts, I could feel the same taint of evil lingering there. Then I found the diadem and discovered it was a Horcrux. Well, I knew I was in for a struggle. But I am Gilderoy Lockhart. I don't give up. So I started hunting the Horcruxes, and taking care of his Death Eater followers. All the Death Eaters were criminals of the worst sort: beep, murder, torture, each of them did all those deeds. There were no innocent Death Eaters. Some of them might have been pressured by their families into accepting the Dark Mark, at first, but they still participated in evil deeds, and eventually grew to consider them justified. And then, when Voldemort disappeared that Halloween, they escaped punishment with lies and bribes. So, I became judge, jury, and executioner. I have a terrible stain on my soul, Gary said tiredly, staring into Harry's eyes, but better it is me than you. He paused a moment thinking. You are my redemption, Harry. I need you to live your life to the fullest, to love and be loved. To have the family you never had. Do those things and everything I have done will be worth the sacrifice. Harry stood quietly, then stepped close and hugged the older wizard. I don't care what you did, Gil, you are still the best wizard, man, I have ever met. Gary took a deep breath, deeply moved. Thank you, Harry, he said as he hugged the boy back. He wasn't about to cry, it was merely dust in his eyes that was making them wet. He cleared his throat. And that brings us to the here and now. Lockhart reached into his pocket and pulled out his glass sphere. It was opaque. The magics had fully charged, now, and nothing could get in or out of it, not even light. He gazed at it a moment, smiling. He handed it to Harry. Throw this through the veil, Harry. What is it? Harry asked as he took it and turned it over in his hands, examining it. I'll explain in a moment, just toss it through the veil. Harry shrugged, and threw it underhand in a short arc that hit the veil in the center. The voices from the veil got much louder, and the veil itself billowed outward as if hit with a great wind. Then it gradually quieted and settled down. Gary said as he turned to look at the crystal ball being levitated by the unspeakable, which remained brightly glowing. Oops, he said, as if embarrassed. The unspeakable gasped, the prophecy is still active. He's not dead. There must be one more Horcrux. He turned to the other wizard, rage building in his tone. You said you had accounted for them all. Harry was watching with eyes wide, horror creeping into his expression. Smugly, the prankster wizard said, "Oh, I did," as he flicked his fingers at the crystal and removed the spell he had placed on it earlier. The glow abruptly disappeared, leaving it dull and dark. "You idiot," the unspeakable said in outrage. He pulled out his wand and waved it over the hovering prophesy sphere, and studied the glowing runes that appeared. "It is done," the unspeakable growled angrily. He reached up and grabbed the crystal ball and dropped it into a pocket in his robe. "It is just as you said, Mr. Lockhart." His voice was clipped and as insincere as possible. You didn't have to see his lips to know he was sneering as he said, "Thank you." Harry had the impression that the unspeakable was barely restraining himself from hexing the infuriating wizard. Lockhart smiled widely. "Harry, Voldemort, also known as Tom Riddle, has been removed from this plane of existence by your hand, as prophesized. And then laughed at the stunned expression on the boy's face. While you were dead, I stunned, shrunk, and sealed Squirrelmort into an impregnable prison, that glass ball. The ball was indestructible by magic, from either inside or out. That was my original plan, after all. And now that all his Horcruxes are gone, it was safe to dispose of him. Although, it was tempting to just keep it on my desk at home as a trophy. Everyone would see it and not realize that the most dangerous dark wizard in centuries was inside that innocuous black ball that I used as a paperweight. He sighed mournfully at the loss. After a moment's pause, in which his audience of two stared at him incredulously, he added defensively, "It was only a thought. Anyway, we know all the Horcruxes are gone because the prophecy sphere is now dark." He, of course, couldn't tell them he knew exactly what all the Horcruxes were because he had already destroyed them in another version of the future. Let them think he was so arrogant as to assume he had destroyed them all when he might have missed one. Maybe they would think twice, themselves, before doing something just as monumentally stupid in the future. Gilderoy said, "There is one more thing to do." He pulled a wand out of his pocket. It was very old and very worn. Harry stared at it a moment before exclaiming, "Isn't that Dumbledore's wand?" The unspeakable seemed to give a start. It was difficult to tell. "No, Harry, it isn't his wand," Gary explained. "His wand is buried in his tomb." He brandished the wand, holding it vertical in two fingers by its handle. He casually flicked underhanded it through the veil. "That was the so-called Elder Wand," he said as the wand vanished through the gray curtain. "Dumbledore won it from Grindelwald. It was also called the Wand of Destiny, and the Death Stick." From the way the unspeakable moved, it was clear he was as dumbfounded as Harry. "You had the real Elder Wand," the unspeakable said incredulously. "Not anymore," Gary said, smirking. "And now it has been returned to its rightful owner. The swath of death and destruction caused by those seeking and using that wand is at an end." He smiled to himself. "A promise is a promise. And I always keep my promises. Even to myself." He looked over at the unspeakable. "And, yes, before you ask, not only do I know where the other two items are, I had all three in my possession at the same time. And for quite some time." He turned and looked back at the veil. "And now no one else will ever have that opportunity, not that it meant much anyway." He turned back to the unspeakable. "Mr. Croaker," the unspeakable gave a small start at Lockhart, apparently knowing who it was in the cowl, "you can officially record that the Elder Wand, the Wand of Destiny, the Death Stick, the wand allegedly given to one of the Peverell brothers by death itself, has been tossed through the veil." He sighed and rubbed the side of his face tiredly. It really wasn't all that powerful, anyway. The innate power of the wizard or witch using a wand is of far more import than any magic in the wand wielded. He looked over at Harry, who was staring back and forth between the two wizards. "Come, Harry, our business here is completed." He turned and the two of them headed back up the stairs of the small chamber, leaving the unspeakable behind to catch up. It was as the doors to the lift to the rest of the ministry were about to close that he called out to the unspeakable, "Oh, by the way, Saul, if you and the ministry are nice enough to Harry and me, I might just let you have the resurrection stone. It really does let you call back the dead and converse with them." The unspeakable turned and appeared to be looking at them as the doors closed. You could almost imagine his jaw dropping open in surprise. "But first, Harry," Lockhart said, turning to small boy beside him, "how would you like to speak with your parents for a few minutes when we get home?" And that was how Harry Potter Peverell Gryffindor Delacour cast Tom Riddle through the veil of death. He left out his remarks regarding the resurrection stone, of course. No need to bring up the whole Master of Death situation. Complete details on how I, Gilderoy Lockhart Slytherin, 3-time awardee of the Order of Merlin, First Class, member of the Dark Force Defense League, award-winning author, 20-time winner of Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award, Hogwarts' Most Beloved Headmaster, Slayer of Basilisks, Detector of Dark Wizards, and Curse Breaker Extraordinaire, managed to detect, track down, and defeat the most dangerous Dark Lord of our time is in my forthcoming book, Dancing with Death. It will be available in all fine bookstores. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.